Sounds good. Yeah.
All right, then. Okay, we are live. Very exciting today. Joining me, an extra special guest. Jamie, can you say a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who might not know you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be here. And it's nice to turn the tables as you were a guest on my own Sentientism podcast and YouTube a while back. So it was a great conversation. So I guess my mission in life at the moment, and this has crept up on me, is to talk about the topic we're going to cover today, which is this sentientism worldview. So I did have a sort of quarter century in a traditional corporate career, and have in recent years been focusing on a variety of different sort of NGO and charitable projects that relate to different aspects of philosophy. And yeah, this sentientism idea is rapidly becoming the sort of center of most of the things I'm trying to do at the moment.
Very cool. Yes, and I'm highly supportive of this endeavor of yours. So I am curious about your background a little bit and how you got drawn into this. So you said you had a kind of quarter century of traditional, like, business oriented stuff, but did you have a degree in philosophy or neuroscience, or do you have any interest in this before that kind of turned? Or I'm kind of curious, like, what brought you towards this?
Yeah, so no degree, no professional qualifications in this field at all. So I'm absolutely still an abject amateur in all of the things we're going to talk about. Sometimes I think that helps, but
Yes,
that's
I
maybe it's
agree.
just an excuse. But a lot of these topics have been a real interest of mine since childhood. Since I was a early mid-teens, I was fascinated by the ideas of different worldviews. Originally, I was brought up Christian, and I started explore other types of religious worldviews and non-religious worldviews. That led me into all sorts of different ideas about philosophy. But there was always a strong fascination with different aspects of science as well, whether it's origins of the universe, the nature of the universe. And yeah, that led me through to a fascination with the nature of life and humanity and evolution and consciousness too. So those have long been sort of amateur interests. And then, yeah, in the sort of quarter century corporate world, those are very much pushed to the edges of my life and my time as these things, as tends to happen. But they've always been a fascination for me. So yeah,
Excellent.
this work I'm doing now is sort of bringing them back into the center and really concentrating on them, because the more I've brought them back into the center, the more fundamental and more important they seem to be to me, given the problems we're facing in the world today.
Yeah, absolutely. So the focus, as you like to put it, on what's real and what matters are things I think that everyone is interested in to some degree or other. Of course, you have a distinctive take on that sort of thing. But I think that way of phrasing it is really good at drawing people in, because we all have our pre-theoretic notions about what we think is real and what we think is important. And by drawing people in that way, I think you're already touching on something that they are going to find really relatable. So I think that's a good way to do it. But just to follow up on this thing that you're talking about, so were you raised vegetarian or around animals, or like what? I'm trying to get at kind of what brought you towards the concerns of sentientism in particular.
Yeah. So I guess the personal path on the epistemology side started out being brought up Christian, and then in my teens I became an atheist for a variety of reasons we can go into if you like. But that wasn't very satisfying to me, because atheism in a way is just an answer to one particular question, but there are so
Right.
many other questions we might want to answer. So epistemologically I was then drawn to a broader concept of naturalism in an
Mhm.
epistemological sense, so generally using an evidence and reason-based approach, hopefully with a healthy dose of humility, to understand everything
Yes.
about this universe we all share, not just is there a god or not, which was just one question. So that was a sort of epistemological path to naturalism, epistemological naturalism, which is one of the two tenets of sentientism. But on the ethical side, there was a parallel there too, because part of the reason I moved away from Christianity and ultimately rejected all of the religious worldviews wasn't just because the facts and the evidence didn't seem to stack up for me. But I was seeing ethical challenges that flowed through some of those worldviews too. There were
Mhm.
rich elements of compassion and the golden rule and so on and so forth. But there were also issues with exclusionary ethics where, the compassion was maybe conditional on you being a member of the out group, or
Right.
constrained to those who followed the right rules. And quite often, if you stepped over that boundary, terrible things would happen that didn't seem very, ethical to me.
Yeah.
So, the idea of a perfectly benevolent, compassionate God who is the instantiation of perfect love, torturing countless billions of largely innocent beings for eternity, just didn't seem to stack up with what I thought
Yeah.
of as ethics or morality. So anyway, there was an ethical theme in that shift away from a religious worldview too, and that also, as I was thinking about broader questions, led me beyond atheism, because again, atheism or even more extreme agnosticism, somewhere between those two, doesn't really tell you much about morality, except that you probably shouldn't base it on some notion of a theistic ethics or a divine command theory, but it sort of leaves it open to where you go next. It's a bit neutral on ethics. So that searching led me to humanism as a worldview, which in simple terms, in its modern incarnation, says, look, we have a naturalistic understanding of the world. There probably isn't a God. There probably aren't supernatural things, but we don't need any of those things to be ethical and to be moral. So humanism says, well, we understand things naturalistically, but we layer onto that a universal compassion for at least all humans. We should care about every human, regardless of what they're like, where they come from, how clever they are, how cute they are, what caste they are. It doesn't matter, right?
Yeah, what you call the charismatic animals, right? How charismatic they are.
Well, that's exactly it, right? And it was and largely, but not exclusively, restricted to our species. So that was part of the ethical path. And this is too long an answer to your question.
No,
but the idea of non-human animals. The idea of non-human animals, as with most people, was sort of in the back of my mind. So I grew up with companion animals at home. We lived in the countryside, so I had some exposure to an experience with wild animals, and my interactions with them were by no means consistently compassionate. And I used to go fishing, for example, and I remember there were moments of thinking, this is horrible, right? But again, it was just such a normal thing to do. I didn't really focus on or engage in it that deeply. But the trigger for thinking about it a bit more deeply was largely because my sister was vegetarian from quite a young age. So that always kept it turning over in my head. And at some point, I think in my sort of early mid-20s, I took the decision to go vegetarian purely for ethical reasons, because I didn't want to needlessly cause exploitation, suffering, or death to non-human animals.
Right.
So that side of my ethics was there too, but it was calibrated in quite a narrow way. So in a way, my ethical stance hasn't changed that much today. Now I'm vegan, but at the time there was a genuine ethical, drive to my behavior that said, look, actually putting pieces of the flesh of an animal that's been killed so I can eat it into my mouth, there's such a direct link there between the action that I see as unethical and my personal choice that made vegetarianism quite an obvious step. But it was also quite convenient socially too, because in those days, things are changing rapidly. But in those days, vegetarianism was quite weird, but veganism was really weird. So in a way, and this is embarrassing to say now, right? Because I'm talking a lot about ethics and morality, but it's remarkably common that my choice about my decision was more of a social decision than it was an ethical decision. I almost deliberately avoided engaging with the topics of this gap between vegetarianism and veganism, thinking about dairy and egg production and so on. I almost deliberately avoided the topic, partly because I sort of knew where I would go, and I wasn't socially ready to take what felt like a risk at that point. And
that's interesting.
That lasted for a couple of decades. So again, too long an answer, right? But this theme about moving towards a naturalistic epistemology has been something that was there from my teens, and at least the early signs of, look, it's not just us humans that matter. There's something about non-human animals or the capacity to have experiences that also matters too. So I guess both of these tenets have been bubbling away somewhere in my head for
that's very interesting. I mean, I personally myself was raised vegetarian, as I think we talked about, but I always wonder, just if I hadn't been, would I have turned vegetarian? So I'm always curious and fascinated by these stories of people who come to it for their own, on their own. Of course, now I am also vegan, as you are. And it is interesting too, because for a long time I wondered why, just to follow up on your story, why I wasn't vegan as I was vegetarian. And a large part of it had to do with that my mom raised me vegetarian, and she was such an animal activist, such an animal lover, that I kind of just felt like if it was wrong to eat milk and eggs, that she would have told us. But we were raised
Yeah.
eating that, even though we were taught like we have to treat animals with respect and kindness and think of them as our younger siblings that can't speak and things of that nature. So it was really a kind of a misleading moral role model in a way, that insulated me and didn't cause me to question these things, because I just thought, gee, it would have been pointed out to me already because my mom cares so much about this stuff. And then as an adult, I talked to her about it, and she was like, yeah, this is one of my shortcomings. I never could give up on cheese and dairy. I was like, oh, well, geez. So there's no good reason then. But it is interesting how we can be lulled into these like comfortable, like low areas where we've reached a certain point, we feel fairly good about our moral progress, and we don't look any further for whatever reasons, for comfort or whatnot. So it is fascinating to me.
It's fascinating. And that's one of the great things about the series of conversations I've had so far, is because in a way, this sentientism idea focuses on, epistemology. How do we understand the universe?
Mm-hmm.
And it focuses on, moral scope of who should be included in our compassion and our moral consideration. But in a way, those aren't really the problem. Those are the answers to those things, I think, are almost trivially obvious. And in a weird way, most of humanity sort of gets most of the way to agreeing on both of those points. Who would want to believe things that aren't grounded in evidence and reason, and who would want to needlessly cause suffering to any being that can suffer? It's sort of almost tautological in its obviousness. So the real problem in practical terms comes in social norms, authority figures, institutional patterns. As with many intrahuman problems, right? The issue isn't so much the technical thing about the philosophy or the science. It's humans are weird social animals, and
exactly.
and that can have good impacts, and it can also have terrible impacts. So so the stories about these paths people follow are always fascinating. And there are the rare people who, and I've interviewed some of them, who at 6 years old thought through the science in a simplistic 6-year-old way, thought through the philosophy in a simplistic 6-year-old way, and decided to go vegan and then stuck with it, right? Despite what their family thought. Those people do exist.
I know.
But most of us are a bit more like, you and me, and very much shaped by the environments and the social norms and so on.
Yeah, exactly. We need more people like that. I mean, I have to say, my mom was raised in a non-vegetarian household, and she turned vegetarian as soon as she realized that the meat came from an animal. Like, it was pretty much instantaneous. But she never got past that, which I think is interesting. But just following back up about how your like conversion, if you want to call it that, to atheism, and then this long winding road towards a more inclusive view, kind of expanding out the horizons. It's interesting that you took this route, because a lot of people will challenge the atheistic worldview on exactly this point, that there is no secure ground, so allegedly, for moral truths. And so someone who says, I'm an atheist, but I take like a pretty hardcore moral stance on this thing, seems like something of a contradiction to some people. So I am wondering, like, where do you think in your naturalistic worldview, the source of morality and ethics come from? Like, on what do you base this? And I know you're not a professional philosopher, but obviously you've thought about this a tremendous amount. So I'm just curious, like, how you arrive at that.
So let me give you a couple of different answers, because one thing I want to do is distinguish between my own personal view and the sentientism worldview that I'm trying to develop and popularize.
Okay.
Because one of the things about the sentientism worldview, which I summarize as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So slightly more technically, that's a naturalistic epistemology, as opposed to, for example, a fideism, or using an authority figure, or revelation, or fabrication, or a dogmatic approach, right? It's using good quality evidence and reasoning to maintain and update credences in our beliefs. With, that's partly where the humility comes from. So that's not just science, that's using evidence and reason much more broadly and generously construed as well. It doesn't have to be a randomized control trial, right? So, so that's the epistemological side. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell you what to believe. It doesn't tell you, whether to be a flat earther, or whether vaccines are effective, or whether there's a God. It just says, look, here's the toolkit we should be using, because a naturalistic epistemology gives us the better chance of working out, what is real and what's true. But we may well still disagree over an enormous amount, but at least we have a basis of, shared commitment to using evidence and reason to work it through. So I have loads of specific beliefs that other scientists might disagree with, but hopefully
Right.
we all agree that we should try to ground it naturalistically in terms of epistemology. So the same is true when it comes to the ethics, in that scientism says, we should have compassion for all sentient beings. So more formally, you might describe that as a sentiocentric moral scope. So whatever ethical system you choose to apply, deontological, feminist care ethic, relational, utilitarian, broadly consequentialist, pick your system or a combination of systems. Whatever you choose, you have to include every sentient being in your moral consideration. And that has to be a meaningful moral consideration, right? It has to, so there's at least a baseline, and I suggest non-maleficence is the baseline minimal obligation we should have to every sentient being. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell you necessarily which of those ethical systems you should apply, and I have my own personal views about the flavors I like to use, but it also doesn't answer your question of, okay, but why should we have compassion, or why should we extend moral consideration? So you will find quite a variety of different answers to that question amongst people who have a sentientist worldview. So eventually I will answer your question. But hopefully it's useful to sort of I want to make that distinction, partly because I don't want, part of the idea behind the worldview is that it's broad, it's pluralistic, and it's a baseline. It's very open. And it's something I hope many, many people could engage with and then find their own way through, rather than just disagreeing with my personal opinion and associating it with the word, right? So that's why
you are not sentiism, you're a sentiist.
Yeah, I'm just one of them. I'm just one of them, right? And many of the others disagree. And our online communities and forums, that is really quite obvious, right? And that's healthy, right? That's the point. The whole point is there isn't an authority or a dogma. The whole point is we have an agreed toolkit and agreed moral scope. And there's so much still to fight over, believe me, right? So, so you will find different answers to that question amongst sentientists. I guess there are some people who will say there is no formal structured grounding to why we should extend our moral scope to sentient beings, or indeed have any morality at all. So there are sort of people who maybe are technically nihilists in the sense that they say, well, ultimately, this is just a physical universe. The laws of nature are churning. We're just entities in those patterns up. There's no externally imposed morality. There's no morality in the laws of physics. We're just doing what we're doing. But I still choose, just as a choice, to extend my compassion to all sentient beings. So it's almost like a nice nihilist approach.
Right,
saying,
yeah.
well, it's just a choice. It's just a choice. I can't, impose it on you. I can't tell you there's some perfect answer that would compel you to agree with me. It's just a choice I'm choosing to make. And I hope you'll make the same choice, but it's just a choice. There are others who will adopt more of a sort of moral realist stance, where they will have a view that not just morality, but a sentiocentric morality is itself an objective moral truth that sentientism is part of discovering, and they hope and expect everybody else to come to that agreement, because ultimately it's a real thing. And we should converge towards agreeing on that reality. And this is where my amateurism as a philosopher comes in, because I'm not really sure where I sit, because some people would describe my view as moral realist and some people describe it as anti-realist. But in a way, it's a sort of conditional realism where I'm quite comfortable drawing a link between the good and bad of an experience for a sentient being to the good and bad and right and wrong of ethics and morality. I'm quite comfortable making that connection, such that, if I suffer, by just the definition of the word, that's a negatively valenced experience for me. Right. So if someone causes me to suffer without a justification, that is the essence of a immoral act or an amoral act, if they don't care either way. Right. So I'm quite comfortable drawing that link from the valence of an experience, which is, I guess, the central concept of being a sentient being, through to the good and bad and right and wrong and the judgments we might make of morality. And in a sense, that is objective, conditional on the existence of sentient beings.
Right.
So if you imagine a lifeless universe with no sentient being, no capacity to suffer, to flourish, to experience any valence whatsoever, I don't think there's any morality or any ethics in that universe. So in that sense, it's not objective. I don't think it's like a sort of Platonic thing floating out there. Like, no, that's not really what moralists think necessarily either. But conditional on the existence of sentient beings, I think morality springs from that. And if that's the approach you follow, I've struggled to find any rationale for excluding any sentient being in a moral consideration if our morality is grounded in what it's like to experience good and bad things. So I don't know how much sense that makes.
No, it's interesting. I guess one question that I was thinking about while you were talking was, is it really the case that you could take any kind of account of morality and end up with a sentientist worldview? Like, for example, you mentioned deontology. And I know you could have versions of deontology that maybe take into consideration animals. But the most famous version of it from Kant does not, and only takes into consideration rational agency, which animals allegedly lack. So so I'm wondering, on your view then, so is it really that you meant to say that any account of morality that you could give, you could make a case for sentientism? Or are there some accounts of morality where this doesn't even come up, like the hardcore Kantian who says it's not sentience, it's rationality that matters? I'm curious about how much you think this extends all the way out.
Yeah, I think many ethical systems you could take a sentientist approach, but you don't have to, and many people don't. So I think you could take a deontological approach which looks at rules or concepts of rights, and you can then very easily extend that beyond the Kantian approach to non-human animals, as Korsgaard and many others have done, for example. Utilitarianism gets there very naturally, although disappointingly many utilitarians still seem to be quite focused on us humans as being the sources of utility, but it's sort of from Bentham built in that can they suffer is the question. I think
Mill builds it out when he says there's higher and lower pleasures, which I think a lot of people would distinguish.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are distinctions that people can make. So I think there's a portfolio of different ethical systems you could use, a care ethic and so on, to apply a sentientist approach. But that doesn't mean those systems necessarily lead you to a sentientist approach. Okay. I think they should, but many people would disagree with me. I think there are some approaches to ethics that I think it's much harder to make fit. So if you are, a pure nihilist, or you take a really strong form of moral relativism that in a sense is similar to nihilism, it's just saying, well, descriptively, so this group has agreed a set of rules, so by definition that's moral for them regardless of the suffering they cause. In a sense, I think that's both of those approaches are an abandoning of morality rather than a flavor of morality. Or you could have a divine command sort of morality or ethic where ultimately what's good or bad is defined by what the deity tells you to do and by the nature of the deity themselves, which again is completely independent of the impacts of your actions or the suffering you might cause. So I think there are types of morality, nihilism, strong relativism, divine command theory, that don't really fit with a sentientist approach at all, because a sentientist approach is insisting that morality should involve a concern for others, and those others should include all sentient beings. So does that make sense? But that still leaves there's a bunch of different ways you can put that into practice. You could have a virtue ethics that talks about kindness and justice, but that justice has to be extended to all sentient beings for it to be sentientist.
Right.
Or you could have a rights-based view, but for it to be a sentientist rights-based view, it has to extend rights to all sentient beings. Or a feminist care ethic, that care has to be extended at least in some form to every sentient being.
Yeah, I guess
there's different ways you could implement it.
Yeah, I was mishearing you. I thought you were saying that every moral system kind of like entails or logically implies that you should be a sentientist. But rather what you're saying is that most moral systems are compatible with sentientism.
Yeah. And obviously I'm a bit biased, right? But in every one of those different ethical systems where you can get to a sentientist conclusion, I've never seen a compelling reason why we'd exclude any sentient being. So when people do take a deontological approach or a virtue ethics approach or a utilitarian approach, and then they restrict their moral consideration to an in-group or an in-species. I've never seen a good rationale for doing that isn't, in some sense, arbitrary.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you about that. But just following up on this divine command theory and the stuff about religion, it seems built into the sentientist worldview that it's kind of atheistic and naturalistic. So I am curious whether you think that that is the case, or whether you could be a sentientist Christian or a sentientist Muslim or a sentientist Buddhist, or do you think those are incompatible in some way?
Yeah, I think it's possible, because there's a distinction between the epistemology and the ontology. So I think the vast majority of people who say, look, I'm a sentientist and I have a naturalistic worldview, they probably don't adhere to any religious or supernatural beliefs.
Yeah.
But I think you could, there are people who say, look, I do believe in a deity or a God, and I ground that explicitly in what I see as good quality evidence and reasoning.
Right.
And they, so in that sense, they could be a sentientist who's committed to a naturalistic epistemology, but they do have some beliefs in the supernatural. Now, for me, they tend to collapse quite quickly together, because in a sense, if I'm grounding my beliefs and credences in evidence and reason, and that evidence comes from reality around me and natural sources, I struggle to understand how I could get really good quality evidence about something that was beyond the natural, that was supernatural, because it seems as soon as I get some evidence of this phenomena, the evidence itself is natural because I'm experiencing it in some way. It's coming into my senses, or it's being processed in my brain. So that almost makes the supernatural thing, as soon as I have evidence of it, part of the natural world.
Right.
So for me, a naturalistic epistemology leads me to have a very high credence in a naturalistic ontology. But other people, it's a looser connection. And I think for those people,
sorry, go ahead.
Well, and for those people, that's not just a question about religion. You could, find disagreements in almost every aspect of life where we might believe or have different credences and different things. And sometimes people will tell you that their views are based on evidence and reasoning, but when you scratch the surface, it becomes clear that's not quite the case. Right. And there are good ways of testing that. When you explore different types of evidence that go against that view, how open are they to considering that in good faith? Or if the evidence changes, will they change their view? So quite often, if someone says, well, my views are grounded in evidence and reason, but I refuse to engage in evidence that disagrees, or if the evidence changes, I'm still sticking with my view, the reality is they are actually locked into something that is more dogmatic or more fideistic. But yeah, no, I think there's still some space there for people to say, look, I'm committed to using evidence and reason. That gives me a decent credence in some sort of theistic belief. And then at least we can have a conversation about the evidence and the reasoning and work that through together.
So what would you call someone who said, I'm committed to the existence of the supernatural, a deity of some sort, but I believe that the deity commands compassion for all sentient creatures. So they reject naturalistic epistemology, but they sort of endorse the idea about sentient. Are they not a sentientist in your view? So I'm asking because I'm curious, how much is the naturalistic worldview and epistemology a core part of the view?
Yeah, so I think it is a core part of the view. So I'd describe that as a sentiocentric view rather than a sentientist view.
Okay.
And there's a distinction some people won't necessarily recognize, because the two words sentiocentric and sentientism have often been used almost as equivalents in fields of philosophy. And I think that's partly because most of the people using those words have such an intuitive naturalistic worldview anyway. It didn't really strike them as an important distinction to make. So it focused very much just on the moral scope piece, but not on the naturalism, not on the naturalistic epistemology. So one of the things I've been suggesting is that in the same way as you can think of a sliding scale of moral scope from, for example, anthropocentrism through to biocentrism and ecocentrism, sentiocentrism fits into that spectrum. So you can go from anthropocentrism, concern centrally for humans, a sentiocentrism, concern centrally for sentient beings, biocentrism for living entities, even non-sentient ones, and ecocentrism that goes beyond that to ecosystems and even rocks, rivers, and trees, concepts that aren't even living. So in that sense, sentiocentrism is a term that focuses very clearly just on how we set our moral scope of inclusion, but is neutral about epistemology and how we understand the world. So I'd suggest that person has a sentiocentric view. I would enthusiastically work with them as an ally to try and drive the implications of that compassion through our world. And quite a few of those people, join in our sentientism groups and communities and, work together with us on all sorts of different stuff, even though they don't share our naturalistic worldview, if that makes sense. But part of the reason I do want to emphasize the naturalism part. And some people will say this to me. It was like, well, I really like what you're doing with this worldview and the movement you're trying to develop around it. But isn't this insistence on a commitment to a naturalistic epistemology, isn't that a bit problematic? Doesn't it annoy some religious people we might want to work with, and engage with constructively? Is it really important? Surely what matters is our scope of moral consideration. That's the only thing that really matters.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's true. And so part of the reason I do focus on it, it's not to exclude people with a supernatural worldview or with a faith-based or a dogmatic worldview at all, because I think we'd work with them in common cause on all sorts of different things if they have an expansive compassion for non-human animals, and they're welcome in all of our forums and groups. But the reason I do think naturalistic epistemology is important is because I think if we're wrong about the world, we're just, our credences are set wrong. We believe stuff that isn't true. Even richly compassionate people can end up in terrible places. So there are many examples from history and today where genuinely compassionate, good people have false beliefs about reality that lead them into doing terrible things.
Right.
And maybe a more prosaic thing to think through is the way humans think about animal agriculture today, right? Which I think to you and to me is an abject, unethical horror and a completely avoidable one. So when you so you might, if you landed as an alien and looked at this planet with a sentiocentric compassion and saw what was happening in animal agriculture and many other forms of exploitation, one conclusion you could come to is most of humanity is basically morally broken. Right? They're arbitrarily excluding vast quantities of sentient beings from their moral consideration and are brutalizing them in horrible ways. But then I think when you land on your spaceship and you interview some people and you talk to them, you probably find that most people are just nice, decent, ordinary people.
Right. And
they're not evil. You talk to them about non-human animals and they'd say, of course, we should care for non-human animals and their suffering matters, and why would I needlessly cause harm? So there are some people who have made an ethical mistake, right? They are deliberately and clearly anthropocentric. They genuinely think, for example, that ethically we should not care about non-human animals. But I think those people are very rare. The people who've actually made an ethical error when it comes to animal agriculture, you struggle to find many of them. I mean, there are some of them on Twitter, but you can find anything on Twitter.
Exactly.
Most of the problem, when you say to people, well, why do you still support this industry? It's not errors of ethics or mistakes in morality.
It's facts.
It's epistemological errors. It's facts, right? And do they really believe them, or have they been told them? Different questions, right? But actually, it's the fact. So there are some people who will deny the sentience of non-human animals.
Yeah.
So look, they cannot suffer. And that's getting rarer and rarer over time because the science is so overwhelming. There are people who will say that the practice of aquaculture and farming don't harm non-human animals. That slaughter, for example, can be done in a humane way, where the word humane means kind and compassionate, implying that you can kill a non-human sentient being that doesn't want to die in a kind and compassionate way because you want to sell bits of its body. That's an odd belief to hold. Or some people believe that it's impossible for humans to survive or be healthy without consuming these animal products. So yes, it's a shame, but what choice do I have? Right? And these are epistemological errors, not ethical errors. I'd argue that they're more of the problem than the ethics. I think most people probably share your and my ethics in theory. There's a puppy downstairs or a companion animal, or you even get them to spend some quality time with a pig or a chicken or a fish or an insect, right? People don't want to hurt these beings unless there's a really strong justification for it. But it's the epistemology that's the problem.
Yeah.
So that's partly why I do come back to saying, look, I'm nervous if we just focus on moral scope and compassion, that can be taken in dangerous ways if people don't have a naturalistic grounding of their understanding of reality. It doesn't always have to, but often that's the case. And many of the ethical problems we see in intrahuman ethics, as well as interspecies ethics, I think are driven as much by epistemological errors as they are ethical errors. And the two feed each other, right? Because to justify an ethical exclusion, quite often you have to believe things that aren't true to justify those ethics. And if you make some epistemological errors about, another race of humans or another group of humans or another species, that can then justify your ethical exclusion. So I do, I guess that's why I think we need a good epistemology and good ethics. Neither is good enough by itself.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, there's some really striking examples too from history that are pretty gruesome. So even some of the most people we consider debauched and horrible people in the world, like Himmler and those guys. Bernard Williams wrote this nice essay where he quoted some of Himmler's diary, where he says he has compassion for the Jews, he feels bad for them, but he has this duty to do what he has to do. So it's a case where he's compassionate, and I mean, it's hard to think of him as compassionate, to be honest, but in his journal he's talking about how bad he feels having to do this stuff, but like duty compels him. So it's a bad theory. I mean, that was kind of Bernard Williams' point in that essay, was that we're kind of stuck because on the one hand, bad theories can lead us astray, but on the other hand, close relationships can lead us astray too. And his other example is Huck Finn. But anyway, so I don't want to get too distracted, but I do take your point that if you're just, you could be very compassionate, but if you have these weird views, then you're going to be doing horribly immoral things. However, I do wonder if there is like really in the philosopher's sense, a true dichotomy here between what you call the naturalistic epistemology and a supernaturalistic one. Because isn't it the case that most people have a bit of a mixed bag? I mean, maybe not you or I, since we're pretty thoroughly committed atheists for many, many years. However, take your average person. I don't think that the average religious person is anti-science in a certain way. They certainly can be reasoned with with empirical evidence. They also have some strange beliefs about revelation and, God talking through burning bushes and stuff like that. So yes, they have that kind of dogmatic view about that, taken on faith, but then also, you could confront them with some evidence and they might change their mind on this or that view, but not the larger picture about whether God exists or something like that. So I do wonder if like you could have an in-between view where you have kind of a commitment to being, naturalistically challenged, but you could still, believe in some higher source, higher power. I mean, I don't want to be that type of person. I'm not asking this question because I have these views. I just think that, like you were saying, it does seem a bit exclusionary and a bit like off-putting to people to say that this view has to be naturalistic, or else you're not really doing the thing that we care about. Or in other words, not naturalistic friendly, but like fully atheist in order to like really commit to this view. And I wonder, so if you think that that's like something that could be a middle ground.
I think it could be. And again, I think this is maybe seem a weird thing to say given what I've said so far, but I think a naturalistic epistemology can still leave us open to the possibility of a supernatural ontology. Right? I mean, anything could be possible. So, and I think a good way of thinking that through is that quite a few, very committed atheists, I think, have moved away from a naturalistic epistemology because they've become dogmatic about their atheism.
Yeah.
Right. So, and my own thinking about this has shifted over time as well. When I started out on this, I was thinking more about the ontology, the natural world versus the supernatural world, and do supernatural things exist? And over time, I've shifted to focus more on the epistemology, partly for this reason, because what I'm challenging with this idea isn't a supernatural ontology, as you shouldn't believe in that. What I'm challenging are grounding beliefs or grounding credences in things that aren't linked to reality. So the sorts of things I'm resisting are more things, epistemologies like fideism or faith,
right,
where you're saying I've chosen to believe something regardless of the evidence, right? And the evidence is, in a pure sense, irrelevant here because I have this faith. Or a dogmatic approach that says I have these beliefs and they will not change regardless of the evidence. Or a revelation based on some authority that says, if God tells me to kill my firstborn child, then that's the thing I will do, right? So the reason I'm resisting those is not because is because I think they're very unlikely to help you understand reality accurately and may take you off the rails ethically. So whereas I think an approach based on good quality evidence and reasoning is much more likely to give us a chance to be roughly right.
Right.
But a naturalistic epistemology, one that absolutely by no means guarantees you're right about anything. And as soon as you think you're 100% right, you've made a mistake epistemologically, because you should always leave some space for even crazy stuff, right? Because anyone who has a basic understanding of modern physics knows that it's full of totally crazy stuff, right? So I think we should be ontologically open. I think it's conceivably possible there could be a deity, right? I describe myself as an atheist as a shorthand, but I'm not 100% sure there's no God. By absolutely. Okay. And I can acknowledge that there is some evidence that might point you towards theism. I think that's a healthy approach.
Yeah.
So again, that's a long answer, but that's why I'm more focused on the epistemological commitment to using evidence and reason than I am a denial of the possibility of the supernatural. I think these things I think they're very unlikely, but they're possible, and we should just be open-minded and keep following the evidence.
Yeah, so that's helpful. So that is fideism and dogmatism that really you see as sort of really deeply incompatible. With the approach.
I think so. And part of the reason is because in a sense I see those things as being arbitrary in a way, right? If you believe something based on faith that isn't grounded in evidence, or you believe a dogma that isn't connected to the evidence, it might as well be arbitrary. I mean, and once you've moved into that mode, there's nowhere to go in a discussion, right? If I say, based on faith, I don't know, pick some belief, right? The earth is flat, or you don't exist, and it's a faith-based thing. The conversation has basically ended. I mean, there's no purchase on that. So part of the difficulty is, I think there are many beliefs that people have based on faith, or based on dogmatism, or based on revelation from some authority that can be quite benign, right? They might actually incentivize their compassion, and that can be a wonderful thing. But the difficulty is, as soon as you've accepted the validity of a belief that isn't grounded in reality, you've opened the door to extremely harmful beliefs that aren't grounded in reality. And once you've opened the door, it's very hard to shut again, because if you've said, well, that's your belief, that's your faith, that's the dogma you stick with, you've got no basis to push back on it. So that's, again, it's partly why I sort of the naturalism, the naturalistic epistemology is important to me.
I see. Okay, so changing topics slightly, I wonder if you think that sentientism, as we've been defining it, entails veganism, or whether there's wiggle room there, because there's all sorts of weasel words that show up, like harm without justification, for no good reason, and these other sorts of escape hatches. So I do wonder if someone could be a sentientist in your view, and think that there's good reason to think that these harms are justified, at least in some cases, or something like that, or where you come down on that.
Yeah, so I think there's a pretty strong link. So, I'm vegan because of my sentientism, if you like. And the reason for that partly comes back down to the definition of words like compassion and moral consideration, because you're right, there's all sorts of wiggle room in the story that can lead you to veganism. You can deny the sentience of non-human animals, you can deny that harms are being done, or you can, and I think this is actually the most insidious tactic, which is very commonly used, is you can actually claim that, for example, animal farming practices are consistent with compassion, moral consideration, and being humane, right? And to my mind, the reason that's the most insidious resistance is because it's destroying the very meaning of those words. So to my mind, if you were to say to me, look, Jamie, I have moral consideration for you, I have compassion for you, I'm going to treat you humanely, but then you treated me like any, aquatic or land animal is in any farm anywhere in the world, not just factory farm, but the supposedly nicest family farms, right? I would immediately turn to you and say, what you are doing to me is not humane, it's not kind, it's not compassionate, it doesn't meet even the minimal requirement for any moral consideration here. And I guess more technically what I suggest is that those words at the very least should imply an obligation of non-maleficence, i.e., we should at least try not to cause suffering, exploitation, and death to any sentient being. So that's partly why I draw quite a clear link between having moral consideration for a being and the implication of veganism.
Well, how does death get in there, though?
So that's an interesting question, because some will say if you're only interested in the sentience of the sentient beings, you're interested in their experiences, and you could find some way of killing without suffering and without pain,
right,
would death itself intrinsically be a wrong? And I had an interesting conversation with Peter Singer about this when he came on the Sentientism podcast.
Well, I haven't seen that one. I have to watch it. Because
Yeah,
it's exactly
and
my kind of objection to utilitarianism is I don't think they have a good answer to this. So I'm curious to hear what you might have to say.
I don't think they do either, right? So the first point is that thought experiment has nothing to do with animal exploitation or agriculture whatsoever, because there is no painless killing. There's no euthanasia. Secondly, it has nothing to do with it because at the very least there are family and group members and others impacted. Thirdly, the overall process end to end is generally pretty horrific and exploitative and unpleasant. So one, okay, it's a thought experiment, right? But let's not kid ourselves. It has anything to do with current animal agriculture.
Exactly.
And believing that it does is one of the epistemological errors we talked about before, because many people will at least kid themselves that this is exactly how animal agriculture works, right? Long, happy lives and a peaceful, death post euthanasia, right? So that's the first point. The second point is that, and again, my thinking on this has shifted, because when I started out working on this, I probably was thinking more about moment-to-moment sentience as being the raw material of morality and ethics. But over time, I've shifted instead to thinking about moral inclusion for sentient beings as beings. So that doesn't mean we just have to care about their sentience or their momentary experiences. What it means is that as a moral imperative, we should consider their perspective and their interests, whatever those are. And to my mind, that almost seems tautological to most modes of ethics, that in somehow we're considering the other and taking that into account in choosing what to do. So when we try and do that, I think that does open us up to a broader range of things that might matter to that sentient being. And some people would still draw those things back down to their momentary sensory experience. But that does open the door up to things like autonomy or agency or other things that could be important to that sentient being. And I think an interest in continuing to live and not being killed is pretty central to most sentient beings, because I think it's probably one of the most deep evolutionary drives that led to sentience existing in the first place, right? If a sentient being doesn't have an interest in most circumstances in continuing to live and not being killed, I'm not sure what interest it might have. So I think that, almost regardless of the harm done, murdering someone is a bad thing to do, right?
Right. So it's almost like a shift between like traditional utilitarianism and preference utilitarianism, where you stop focusing on like pain and pleasure and you start focusing on maximizing the preferences of the individuals. Do you think that, at least from a utilitarian point of view, would capture what you're talking about?
I think it probably would. It would at least open the door to that. It wouldn't necessarily insist on that, but it would say that, we should, if we're going to have moral consideration and compassion for someone, we should consider what's important to them and act with that in mind. And killing them is, except in genuine compassionate euthanasia, killing them is not generally in their interest. So we shouldn't do it. It's a wrong in that sense. So I think it opens the door broader than a sort of a very narrow hedonic moment-to-moment utilitarianism. It says, look, other things might matter to sentient beings, and all sentient beings should matter.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I grew up thinking that it was wrong to eat meat, that the bad thing was eating the meat. And then when I started interacting with other people, what I found out was no one else really believes that. What they believe is like wrong to kill animals, it's wrong to cause them to suffer. But like if you could get the meat magically without having to do any of that, then it would still be okay. And I really struggled with that. I still don't really have that same intuition. I sort of feel like it's disrespectful to the kind of creature to turn them into energy for my purposes, so that I can go walk to the subway or like climb a set of stairs or something like that, and to think of them as
and I've had some fascinating conversations with people who want to go beyond. So that's one of the other things I've tried to do with sentientism, is also to not make it you don't have to say only sentience matters. You have to have compassion for all sentient beings, but you could go beyond that if you want. So you can compare about you could care about other things that matter to those sentient beings, but you could even go beyond sentient beings if you want to. So I've had conversations with people like Nico Dillon, who's been exploring whether agency should matter, independent of sentience going beyond. And I've talked to people like Susanna Monzeau, who talk about the idea you were just mentioning of dignity, right? Is there something about the dignity of a non-human animal that should be a moral motivation for us, regardless of their experience? And I'm somewhat cynical of some of those things because they feel a little bit more to me like human concerns than a genuine concern of the other being. But I'm quite open to people who want to go beyond sentientism. I'm much more concerned with people excluding sentient beings than I am people saying, can't we add some extra stuff in, over and above sentientism? So it's quite open in that way.
I see. So,
I wanted to come back to your question about the wiggle room as well, because I think that's an important point about sentientism and veganism, because there are some differences between the philosophies, but I think they overlap very strongly. I guess one thing I would say is there's actual wiggle room and practicality even within the definition of veganism itself, right? So the definition of veganism talks about, as far as practical and possible, it's not some sort of purity thing where it's, you're binary, and if you meet the vegan standard, you're ethically perfect, and if you don't, you're out. It has, as far as practical and possible, built into the very definition. So there's, I think, an intelligent, you might call it a wiggle room, but as long as it's dealt with in a good faith way, right? People might use that as an excuse. People will say, it's not practicable for me not to eat bacon because I really love bacon, right? Okay, we know what you're doing. It's very funny, exactly. But it's not good faith engagement with the definition of veganism. And so you can find those same things in sentientism as well, because you can, as you say, you can say, well, okay, I agree we should have this baseline obligation of non-maleficence where we shouldn't needlessly cause harm. But what does need mean? Right? And so, of course, you can then have plenty of conversations with those, and I'm happy to do that if it's done in a good faith way. But I like bacon is not a need, right? We have to be serious about what these words mean and where we're going. But again, like veganism, it's not a pure perfection thing. It doesn't pretend to solve difficult moral trade-offs. It doesn't pretend that there's going to be an easy answer to every ethical situation. It leaves the door open that there may well be situations where it could be justifiable to harm or kill, just as it is in human ethics. If I see a mass murderer running towards a school bus with a machete, I'll quite happily, do whatever it takes to take that person out. This is not an injunction against harming or killing, but it's just saying that, we have to have serious moral consideration for all the sentient beings involved in these situations and engage with that in good faith. And there is a danger that the wiggle room can be used in bad faith ways, but
so there's a couple of wiggle room type issues that I was had in mind when I asked that question. So one of them, I have like from kind of ordinary to far-fetched. Philosophers love our far-fetched. I'll get to the far-fetched.
Yeah.
But the kind of ordinary ones start with like, I remember having this big argument with someone many, many years ago where they were saying, look, I'm very kind and compassionate, but I want to eat animals. And I respect the animals and I treat them as well as I can. Minimize any kind of pain, but of course, you can't get rid of the pain completely. But they thought that was compatible with respecting and being compassionate towards the animal because it was part of like an enrichment that it enriched their life in a certain way. And that was what is important for this person was, enriching their life. So, that's a bit arbitrary and we could have a whole debate about that, but it does kind of open this, the idea of like, if you think of, the traditional Native American who's like, very reverent of the spirit of the animals, but sees it as necessary to use, they're in this harsh environment. They need they don't have a lot of resources. And, so this is unfortunately what is required to do, but they're very respectful of the animal. They even as they're killing it, they're, appreciative, saying thank you to its spirit or whatever, if they believe in that sort of stuff. So are you going to say that they're not truly being compassionate or they're misusing the word, or is it that this is a weird extenuating circumstance? So I am curious about how, so obviously I think factory farming is out, obviously. But like a lot of these like more like personal interactions with the animals where there is this deep reverence to the animal and what it's providing for you and how the animal is actually giving up its life in order to provide for you. So I have met people who I feel sincerely kind of feel that way. That they genuinely feel like a respect towards the animal giving up its life for them. And so, you know, I mean, I don't share their view, but I'm just wondering, like, on the sentientist worldview, what do you make of a person like that?
Yeah, this question of, justifiable and need is a really important one. And there are absolutely situations where for survival or sustenance needs, people, effectively don't have another choice. And I can understand that, and respect that to a degree, in the same way as in extremis we do within intrahuman ethics, right? There are situations where people will do things that we consider deeply unethical within intrahuman ethics in extremis, and we go, well, yeah, we understand why, right? There was a need to do that. So there's absolutely space for that. I think we do need to be a little bit careful about putting too much weight on and traditional ways of doing things, or things that humans have come to see as important to themselves. That does matter, right? The fact that something is important to a human matters because they're a sentient being as well.
Mm-hmm.
But where that justifies harming others, I think we need to be a little bit careful about it. And you can see that story told, not just talking about, different lifestyles of various indigenous communities, which, you can't summarize across because they're so various and diverse and rich, and I should let them speak for themselves. But you'll find that story coming through from, American cattle ranchers as well. It's a story of tradition, it's culture. We care about the cows. It's a circle of life, so on and so forth. And there can be stories of respect and reverence, and is this some sort of symbiotic relationship where we look after them, they give their lives to us? And I can feel the pull of that, but we have to be very careful, because what those perspectives are doing is failing to take the perspective of the other, right? The animal, when it is, whether it's hunted or whether it's slaughtered, is not feeling respect. It is not giving its life. They're not giving their life, right? This is not a symbiotic thing. Yeah. The very language is clouding, and that's true whether it's someone, who comes from a hunting culture or whether it's a rancher, right? The language is clouding it. It's all about what's going on in the human's head. It's nothing to do with what's going on in the head of, in simple terms, the victim, because what that victim wants is probably to live a long, happy life with their family. They don't want to be harmed or killed or constrained, right? So there is a danger with some of that language, that it can feel, progressive and open and respectful, but it's failing to take the perspective of the other. And I think one of the interesting things is that within many of the cultures where, animal hunting or usage is a pattern of the traditional cultural practice, there are some differences, because I think there is some genuine recognition of the otherness of the animal, and there is some regret in taking a life that can be there, and that can lead often to a much more restrained approach that isn't about, farming or maximizing. It's just taking what we need. So I still think there's an ethical wrong being done there to the being, but it does put it in a different context. But quite often in the value systems that you'll find around the world in many of these cultures, they have a richer connection to a sentientist idea than certainly most of the Eurocentric Western cultures do. So if you look at ideas like, animism or ahimsa, or there are ideas that come through Maori culture or different parts of African culture, that I think do get close to a sentientist idea of recognizing the otherness of non-human animals, and there being some respect. And there are people working in most of those communities, trying to take them in a similar direction, where I think with many of those communities, if they could find a path forward that respected some of their traditional ways of living but didn't cause these harms and killing, they'd be quite happy to go in that direction. And more power to those people. And I think they're much closer to a vegan ideal or a sentientist ideal than the industrialized West is, certainly.
Yes. Okay.
But having said all of that, even if harming and killing is seen as justified for whatever reason, the wrong hasn't been erased, right? The being is still being wronged and being harmed, and we should never lose sight of that being's perspective, even if we do come to a position where we think, okay, it's morally justifiable. It doesn't erase it, doesn't wipe the slate clean. That being still exists. They still had interests or preferences, or a hope or a love for their family, and things are being done to egregiously go against that. Whatever the justification is, we can't lose sight of that.
I think that's a
And
really
us humans are so brilliant at coming up with all of these. I mean, I'd love to know some scientific research from a psychologist about what percentage of human brain activity is dedicated to post-rationalizing things you want to keep doing.
99.98.
It's where most of our brilliance goes. And some of it, feels harsh and dissonant. And some of it we go, oh yeah, that's a really nice idea. I can appreciate that. And, there's the reverence and there's a respect. I'm like, what? Okay. It's still going on in our heads.
Interesting. So just expanding out to my trajectory towards the more ludicrous, I feel like my own views about veganism, sentientism, are most challenged by wildlife conservation ideas. And when I talk to people that are deeply knowledgeable about conservation, I think it becomes really hard to take these sorts of ideas and apply them there, because what is the alternative? If you let the animals untended, then they overpopulate. There's not enough food. They die horrible deaths. Then the population is back into control. So many conservation activists will ask questions like, what is better for the animal, that you let it starve to death, its family starve to death, or that you allow hunting? And maybe people will, eat the meat of the animal that they hunt. Maybe they even enjoy just killing the fucking animal. Who knows why they do it, but they're performing a service actually for the animal, for the population, not necessarily for the one that gets shot, but for the overall population of the deer or the whatever it is, that this is somehow beneficial in a way that just leaving them to their own natural lives would not be. And I have to say that this is, in my own thinking, been something that's really challenged me, because I don't see a good answer either way, because obviously I don't want to condone people going out and shooting these poor deer. But on the other hand, what's the alternative? It seems much worse. So I do wonder, like, in the practical terms, doesn't this seem like a big wiggle room sort of area where we don't really have a good answer? So I wonder what your view on that is.
It's a tough space, right? But this is also another interesting tension sometimes between vegans and sentientists, because many vegans, and in fact, many of the people who founded the vegan movement in the 1940s were motivated essentially by a sentientist stance, right? They were talking about sentience being the reason we cared for animals. It wasn't because animal is a biological taxa that we have some objective concern for, right? It's because animal is a shorthand for the beings that are sentient. So for many vegans, and today, their concern goes to all sentient beings, including those in the wild, living free ranging. Whereas the primary focus of veganism and the definition of it centers mostly on the human exploitation and harming of non-human animals and pushing and driving to end that, but it doesn't explicitly talk about wild animals or those topics. So some vegans will say, look, all we need to do is end human exploitation of non-human animals, and that's the end of the story. Other vegans, and me included, will say, well, actually, I have a sentiocentric concern for every sentient being, and that includes seeing as bad the suffering of a sentient being, even if they have never had any interaction with humans whatsoever. The fact they're suffering still is morally salient to me. So sentientism does push us to go beyond the 8 billion humans and beyond the 100 billion land animals in our farms and beyond the 2 to 3 trillion fishes and however many shrimp, and it pushes us beyond that into the quintillion, quadrillion sentient beings living free ranging in the wild. And many of those beings clearly are still impacted by humans because of our catastrophic impact on the planet. So even if it's indirect, in terms of habitat loss or climate or various other impacts, we're impacting the wild already. So it's in a way not just a question of should we intervene or not. It's a question of we already are intervening, so what should we do about it? But there are fiery and difficult debates both on the big topic of wild animal ethics. There's no doubt a lot of joy and pleasure out there in the wild, but there's no doubt a lot of suffering and horror too. This is a sort of Darwinian hellscape to some extent, right? Evolution is an amoral bitch. So I probably shouldn't be using that language, but you get the impression, right? So there are some people, when we think big picture about the wild, who will say we should have compassion for all of those beings, and maybe there are things we could do to even help. Even if we're not currently exploiting, maybe we should intervene in the wild in ways that should mitigate wild animal suffering. And there are all sorts of different ideas about that. Some are quite, leading edge and sci-fi, and some are much more pragmatic and grounded and already being tested and done. There are others who will say, partly because they're so horrified by humanity's impact on sentientity, if you like, that we just need to end our exploitation, get out of the way, minimize the human footprint, and leave the wild as it is. Either because they're skeptical about humanity, or, and this can go along with it too, or because they have this sort of weird reified view that nature is a wonderful, happy place, then as long as the humans got out of the way, all the animals will be happy, which unfortunately is just not true. And that could lead us back into some of the ideas why I'm not a theist either. This is not a planet that would have been created by an all-benevolent, all-knowing deity, as far as I'm concerned. And wild animal suffering is just probably the most egregious counterexample there. So, but let me bring it back to finally answering your question, which is this idea of intervening in the wild for the benefit of wild animal populations. And I guess I don't see populations as being objects of moral concern in their own right. I don't think a population has an interest. I don't think it can suffer. I don't think it can flourish. I don't think it wants to be a high population or a low population or a growing population. I don't think it has an interest. I don't think it's a morally salient thing at all. Don't think it's interesting. I do come back to the sentient beings, individuals being the only objects of moral concern, because they have this capacity to have experiences, they have interests, and they have preferences. Now, I might go beyond that and thinking about concepts or groups instrumentally, where I might say, well, I can see that population is high here, which might lead to suffering of individuals. But intrinsically, I do come back to the individual sentient beings as being the only objects of moral concern. Okay. So as we look out in the wild and see issues, I think the first thing to do is to work out, one, is it really an issue? Or is it something that, is encroaching on our own human interests in ways we're uncomfortable with? Yes. And you can see that when people talk about, we use categories quite viciously in this mode as well, vermin or invasive species. And you're like, well, what is, or pest, what is the actual problem here? Sometimes there isn't a problem at all. It's just some changes happening and we don't like those animals. And the human response generally is kill them all, right? So as soon as there's any conflict or overlap, or, a deer has eaten some of my crops, the answer is just kill them all. So, I'm not a fan of that approach. And again, this post-rationalization is something that us humans are really good at when it comes to wild animals, right? If we want to go out hunting, we want to, run these businesses and these industries, we come up with all sorts of creative ways to justify it. But at the same time, I don't want to pretend there aren't sometimes genuine problems out there that might require causing harm or even killing, right? There might be a rationale. I guess my appeal is that if we take a genuinely sentientist stance, which recognizes the moral salience of every sentient being that might be impacted in these scenarios, we're much more likely to be motivated to find a better answer. There might be no good option, but we're much less likely to be motivated to let's go kill them all if we genuinely have this deep moral concern. Right. And this moral concern could lead us to more creative ideas. And many people are working on those and piloting them today. So there are people going out and doing vaccination programs for wild animals. And that's not normally for the benefit of the wild animals. It's for the benefit of humans and for livestock, but it does benefit the wild animals. There are things you can do with fencing or wildlife corridors or other interventions that, yes, they do constrain wild animals in ways that they probably don't like, but at least it's not as bad as shooting them. There are things you can do around contraception, darting, and control. That, again, there's been some really interesting pilots around that will give alternatives if there genuinely is a need or a reason to manage populations in some ways, which, again, often I question. There are different ways of doing that. But again, I'm not pretending there's always going to be an easy answer to this or one that doesn't involve some harm. But I would recommend that whenever you're in those conversations, it's worth digging into the motivations of the people who are talking about these things and really understanding what their ethical grounding is. And quite often you will find this post-rationalization coming through. So one fascinating example I came across a couple of years ago when I was in a debate with someone about venison and deer. And the argument was along these lines, where they're saying, look, I don't consume any farmed animal products because of the harm they cause. But because of deer overpopulation, we need to manage the population down. Hunting them seems to be a reasonably ethical way of doing it, given the options we have available. And, once the meat's there, I'm not causing any extra harm, so on and so forth. Right. Yeah. So you can see how that story would play out. But when you actually go to the website of the Scottish Deer Estate Association, and you look at the PDF that tells you how to run a deer estate, there's a big section on there on breeding. So the estates that make money off the hunting trips are deliberately breeding more deer,
right,
and then using overpopulation,
they're stocking it,
which they drove to justify ethically rich people going up and shooting deer.
Yeah, it's a bit.
And
nuts.
Again,
yeah.
So it's quite interesting to just dig a little bit deeper and go, well, if we imagine we genuinely had a sentiocentric concern and we really cared about the sentient beings involved, one, what is the problem this overpopulation is causing? Right? Is there actually a problem here? And then two, are there alternative solutions that don't involve just going out and harming and culling? And three, shouldn't be subsidizing businesses that are deliberately making the problem worse and then using that problem as an excuse to justify themselves? So yeah, I'm very skeptical of any human story where they're like, well, it's really sad, but I just had to go out and kill some stuff, right?
Yeah.
The motivation is much more often a story that they've told themselves and maybe telling others. And
it's interesting
finding more compassionate roots.
Yeah, I'm thinking about my own journey towards veganism. And I remember when I first started, around 2012 is when this happened. I first started realizing about how horrible dairy and farming, all that stuff was. And I started thinking, okay, so we can't do this anymore. But then my wife and I immediately started finding what were called no-kill dairy farms, and some of these are by Hindu people who revere the cows. They're not slaughtered even after they're done being milked or productive. There were other places that did it with goats and so on. So there is a small community of no-kill farms or whatnot. And so we, for a while, we're eating this, cheese products from these places. But I eventually just started thinking, why am I so desperate to have cheese? What is it that's so importantly valuable that even though these animals are being treated in a different way, they're still not great. It's still not perfect. It's still not best for the animal. So I really started, once you dig into the motivations, it turns out it's just I like the taste. I was looking for a way to enjoy the taste, and that doesn't seem like a good enough reason. So I eventually had to stop doing that. But I do find that, we often feel very motivated to try to find some way to make this acceptable. And that very motivation should be questioned, I feel like, which not a lot of people do.
And it relates to a broader topic, which is that there's one of the big things in the zeitgeist at the moment is more and more people are waking up to the horrors of animal agriculture. And there's some really interesting surveys that when you ask about factory farming, very high percentages of people will say, oh, of course, I'm against factory farming, and sometimes that can be 47, 52, around half of people, depending on where you survey, say, oh, I'm absolutely against that. Now, of course, in practical terms, they still buy from it because in the US, 99% is factory farmed and 90% globally is factory farmed. So, but we can put that to one side. At least in theory, they're against factory farming. But what that leaves open is this idea that non-factory farming can still be ethical.
Yeah.
And the tragedy, of course, is that, again, that's an alluring story for us humans to tell ourselves that actually there is a nice way of farming that is respectful. And of course, that's probably where I'm buying from anyway, although I don't really want to concentrate too hard on that. Once again, that's us humans telling ourselves the story and ignoring the interests and the perspectives of the beings going through those processes. Because the very worst parts of the factory farming process for a pig or a cow or a fish are exactly standard in non-factory farming. Right, the family separation, the mutilation without anesthetic, they all end up in the same slaughterhouses. The forcible artificial insemination. Right, these aren't things that only happen in factory farms because the non-factory farms are nice and happy experiences. Right, these standard processes, the worst parts of the process, are also in the nicest family farm too. So again, it's this temptation to go back into our own minds to post-justify rather than and forget about what it might really be like to be a fish or a pig or a chicken in these processes.
So now I want to ask you about something that's a little bit more on the sci-fi side of things, but definitely within the realm of human possibility. And it was kind of, this idea was inspired by an article that came out, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 years ago. It was an op-ed in, I forget which paper, but maybe New York Times, LA Times, one of those big ones. And it was a bioethicist philosopher type whose name escapes me at the moment. I probably should have looked it up if I was going to ask you about it, but I didn't, so I forget. But what they basically were arguing was sort of like sentientism. I don't think they knew about that term, but they were saying we should have respect and concern for our sentient animals, and these animals that we're farming are sentient. We're doing something horribly, immorally wrong. So what should we do about it? Well, their answer was genetically engineer a type of animal that isn't sentient. So one that can still walk around and, behave in relative ways, but one whose pain pathways are just absent, one who doesn't suffer in these sorts of ways. And so, a large part of this guy's argument was that this is actually feasible, that we could sort of do it with the technology that we either have or is coming eventually. So when I read that, I was like horrified, sort of for these reasons that I was just mentioning. That just seems like, why are we so desperate to have this? But on the other hand, a large part of the argument was, globally, people depend on these meat supplies. It's not really realistic for the whole world to switch over to veganism right off the bat. So at least as a stepping stone, is this something that a sentientist should support? Changing a certain kind of animal to be more like a mollusk or a mushroom and less like the kind of animal that it is now. At the end result would be an animal, a creature that doesn't suffer, at least if it were possible. But is that something the sentientists would support?
I mean, I think no. And I can't speak for all sentientists. We have a dazzling variety of views, but the short answer I'd say is no. And I think there's a few reasons for it. One is we don't need a transitional step, right? Because we already have the answer to all of human agricultural problems, and they're basically called plants, right? and it's already running at 4 times the scale we need to supply the current Earth's population. So this idea that we need some other type of meat product as a transitional step just doesn't fit to me. So almost regardless, there are so many better paths. If you genuinely care about sentient beings, there are so many better paths that are just staring ourselves in the face. The idea we need to create that seems, a little bit bizarre, and partly because we have plant-based, we have plants, beans and pulses and legumes and actual plants, right? But we also have the plant-based foods and all the technologies there, and fermentation technologies that are ancient, and there's new modern stuff coming through. There's loads of alternative food paths that we could follow that I think would be much more direct and simple and straightforward, and also ethically cleaner than that approach. I think I also would have some issues that they're thinking maybe about sentience a bit too narrowly. And this is quite common, that people will think, well, sentience is just about, can you feel pain? And if you can't feel pain, you're not sentient. And I don't think that's quite right. I think of sentience as the capacity to have any valenced experience whatsoever. So I can imagine, genetically engineering a pain pathway out, so a cow might not be able to feel physical pain, but I can imagine them still having valenced experiences of other types that absolutely mean they're still a sentient being. We should not,
you mean like cause fear them to, or anxiety or something like that?
Could be fear. It could be, and could be positive things. Could be love their family. Could be, a range of other experiences. I think I'm nervous of narrowing too quickly down on physical pain. And there are many sentientists who say, look, I do care about sentient beings, and I care about sentient, but I also care about autonomy and agency and dignity and so on. And so many of those people would also have your reaction and go, well, this is just horrific. Now, I guess another thought experiment is, to be genuinely insentient, those animals would have to be essentially like a rock, right? Or they would genuinely have to, in their own mind, not care if you tortured them for 6 hours, right? They just would be ambivalent about it, wouldn't mind either way. It just means nothing to them. Right. So, I guess that's just a reverse thought experiment to go, are you really imagining engineering an animal that would still be able to have some sort of vaguely normal life cycle, but would have zero valence, no interest in anything, no I mean, it wouldn't even eat. Right? What would it do? It would be like a rock. It would just sit there. It would have no motivation to move. It would. Do you see what I mean? So I'm just not sure that the thought experiment these people are framing, they're trying to say, well, it's a normal animal. It would live. It would have a family. It would do all the things an animal does. But because it wouldn't feel physical pain, it's okay to do whatever we like. And I'm like, I don't think you can just take the sentience out of a living biological organism and expect it to be the same thing anymore. And, why would we ever want to do? Why would we ever want to go down that path anyways?
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but
if we did have the rock, I kind of am thinking now of the thought experiment from David Chalmers of the philosophical Vulcan, because the philosophical Vulcan is supposed to be exactly this type of creature, which has conscious experience, but no valence. And so, many people have the intuition that these guys don't matter morally, whereas Chalmers tries to argue that they do, and that it's consciousness, not valence, that matters. Although he's not vegan for unknown reasons. Exactly. But so on your view, do these philosophical Vulcans not merit consideration if they're possible? Like forget about what they're actual.
No, it's a good point. And I'm not an academic, but I actually count David's presentation where he talked about this as my first citation, because he posted up one of my articles.
He did, right? Yeah.
So I'm counting that as a citation. I'm like a real person from David, cited by David Chalmers.
You're a real boy now, Jamie.
Yeah, exactly. But again, he talks about broad versus narrow sentientism in that context, and he prefers a broad sentientism, which says you don't have to have valenced experience, you just have to have any experience at all. And again, irritatingly, this is another thing that sentientism itself is a bit neutral about. It just says we should have compassion for all sentient beings. It sort of leaves open whether that means it has to be valenced or not. So personally, I do attribute importance to the valence, because in this common sense way of thinking about morality, I'm trying to take the perspective of the other as far as I can, genuinely imagine what it would be like to be them, what they would care about and what would matter to them, and take that seriously into consideration. So if there is genuinely zero valence there, then I could see that the being might fall out of my moral consideration. I guess the reason in practical terms why I think David and many people have a sort of visceral, negative reaction to that idea, because the idea of the philosophical Vulcan is, a being that in many other respects acts very much like a human, for example. There are sci-fi examples that get close to this, but just doesn't experience valence. Is partly because I think we just have a suspicion that they probably still will care about something. And in all the sci-fi stories, that often is the way it plays through, right? Exactly. They're not, because again, to make this thought experiment work, this philosophical Vulcan, there's data from Star Trek, would genuinely have to be ambivalent about you torturing them to death over days, right? They would literally have to be, I really don't care either way. I'm just not interested, right? And it's hard for us to imagine a being like that. So I think that's partly where the reaction comes from it. But I think part of the reason I'd also wouldn't needlessly harm this philosophical Vulcan is just out of ethical and epistemological uncertainty.
Right. The precautionary
if I was 100% sure, 100% sure of my ethics, 100% sure of my epistemology, technically maybe they'd fall out of my moral scope. But in all practical terms, and because I just don't think you can really separate sentience from beings that have these characteristics, in practical terms, I wouldn't. And again, sentientism doesn't say you should stop here. It just says that all sentient beings should be included. And if you want to include Vulcans too, because they're neutral sentience, or even because they're not sentience, because they might show some autonomy, that's fine. But just make sure you include all the sentient beings.
Okay, interesting. And then finally, in the most far-fetched sci-fi example, I think of Douglas Adams and his restaurant at the end of the universe, where you get to meet your meat, and the the meat comes out from the kitchen and says, "Hi, I'm your dinner tonight," and you get to have a conversation. In fact, he has a philosophical argument about whether it's right to eat this thing, and the thing says, "No, this is my goal, my goal in life, the thing I was meant to do, the thing I value most in life is to be your dinner." And now, obviously, that's a far-fetched science fiction, but it does bring up the question of whether we could genetically modify or engineer animals not to care about their survival in this way, and sort of almost be willing in that sense. Like we could actually provide, genetically modify them so that they did have this desire to be slaughtered or something like that. Would that alter your view about killing this sort of creature?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I struggle in a way because what I'm likely to do in the answer is to start from an intuition and then come up with my own post-rationalizations, right? Because my intuition would be one of abject horror at one, just creating this being in the first place, and two, the act itself. And my post-rationalizations would probably include some degree of distrust as to whether that really was their interest or not. You know, there are, you know, humans who sometimes seem to have self-destructive interests and express them, but we then take I think, sometimes appropriately paternalistic approach to protecting them from their own interests. Maybe that would be one angle. But yeah, so I
mean, there have been some humans who have volunteered to be eaten. It's rare, but it has happened a few times.
Yeah, I mean, again, in a purely technical sense, if it genuinely is in the interests of that being, and you know, I find it hard to object to it without appealing to more intuitive notions of dignity and, you know, some of the other stuff that drives it. But and I guess the only point I would make, and you're very familiar with this, right, is that I love the philosophical thought experiments around the edges of all these topics. You know, where's the boundary of sentience? You know, what does it really mean to need?
They don't change the core case, though, is I guess what you're going to say.
That's the main thing I want to draw people back to, is that I'm happy to talk about these thought experiments with a fellow vegan. Where I really get frustrated is where someone is deliberately using these thought experiments to distract from the fact they're going to have a burger for lunch, right? And I'm like, look, that's fine. This is fun. We can have these discussions. But the core case where the sentience is obvious, the harms are obvious, and there is no need or justification. Can we agree on that first, and then we'll do the thought experiments?
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that, because I've been too many times as growing up and like, oh, well, what about plants? It's like, okay, but we know about cows. Like, we don't know about plants. Like, don't start bringing up plants yet, bro. Like, let's deal with the chickens and the cows first. So I'm fully on board with that. I didn't mean these as distractions or as justifications. I'm just curious about what you're because these are things that in my own life that I've thought about, and I was like, I don't know exactly what the right answer is in these cases.
Yeah, and as a fellow vegan, we're allowed to do thought experiments.
Okay.
I mean, anyone is, but as long as it's done in good
we're
faith.
not doing it for nefarious purposes, hopefully.
No, exactly.
But it does, speaking of plants, it does bring us up something which I was going to ask you about when you mentioned Singer, because you know, one of the things that Singer says in his famous book Animal Liberation is that these ideas shouldn't be based on facts or on science, because they're ethical ideas. And he kind of compares it to the idea that, you know, so the equality of the races is a moral ideal. And if you sort of base that idea on any kind of factual evidence, then you could find out you're wrong. And then what? You have to believe the races aren't equal? Like if you find out factually that, you know, some group of people X is different from group of people Y in some sort of way, then does that mean that you've refuted the ethical idea that they should be treated equally? And so he says, look, this idea is got to be based on some, you know, it can't really be tied to the factual world. It's got to be a normative claim. This is how we should be acting, regardless of the way the world turns out. And I do wonder if like a similar kind of concern might be raised for your defense of the sentience worldview, especially with regard to plants, because clearly we don't know that whether plants are sentient or not, according to your definition, and you are open to evidence and reason. So it could be the case that you find out that, to your level of convincingness, that plants are sentient, and then what? You become a Janus, you starve. Like, what do you do at that point? So, I mean, then the old quip, you got to eat something, and it kind of comes to mind. So I do wonder, like, how much are you willing to put on the, like, science turning out your way?
I think I'm willing to double down on it, because I think if we declare a normative stance that isn't grounded in reality, it again becomes arbitrary, in the same way as me deciding to only care about my own group of humans is arbitrary. I think, and this links back to this the conversation we had a little bit earlier on about moral realism and the is-ought boundary, and whether you can ultimately, I do think it makes sense for our moral normative stances to be grounded in reality in some robust way, and that does mean we are beholden to the evidence and reason, our understanding of reality. So the reason I care about other humans is because I care about what it's like to be them. The reason I care about other animals is because I care about what it's like to be them and their perspectives and their interests. And in simple terms, if it turns out that, a forest of trees with its mycorrhizome network, the tree is sentient and does actually have its own perspective, and it can experience things, arguably with a valence, then I think they should become a moral patient. Mm-hmm. Now, what that means, I think we just got to deal with it, and work that through. And you might move towards technologies which produce fermented products that maybe we're very confident aren't sentient because there are only certain types of plants that are. You might have to revert to an understanding of different gradings of sentience that might say, well, to survive, we're going to have to eat something, but at least let's work at the very bottom end of the sentient scale. So maybe, certain types of plants are of a lower degree of sentience, and we would still move in that direction rather than animals because they have a different degree of sentience and therefore a different degree of moral consideration. So there are a different bunch of paths you could follow, but I think we should follow it because otherwise we have, I think, drawn a somewhat arbitrary boundary and undermined the rationale for our morality in the first place, which is trying to take the perspective of the other. Now, so sentientism doesn't have a stance on whether plants are sentient. It just says, use evidence and reason and follow that reasoning wherever it might lay. And that could lead us to some uncomfortable places. I mean, my current understanding of the scientific consensus is that there's a very strong consensus that plants don't have sentience, and that when you see the articles claiming they do, it's normally the editor of the magazine who's written the headline. It's not actually the scientists who are claiming it. When you dig underneath it, there's not much there. And my understanding as an amateur of the rationale often is because of an evolutionary history and the adaptiveness pressures and questions about motility that seem to have driven sentience and consciousness in non-human animals, because they had a much richer decision environment, and that involved moving around in ways that plants don't seem to do quite so straightforwardly. But it also seems to be driven from the information architectures as well. So we're very familiar with neural firings and nervous systems and so on that go in our minds and animal minds. And I'm not saying that that's the only way sentience or consciousness could run, but plants don't seem to have anything that's even analogous to that, and their rigid cell walls seem to restrict the amount of information or processing or computation they do. So at the moment, my intuitive, or my sort of summary of the scientific consensus is very confident that plants aren't sentient.
Right.
But we should follow it we should follow the science where it leads, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. I mean, I've spoken with some people who think that plants are sentient. At least one of them is a scientist. I guess her reputation is under somewhat of a, people disagree with her, but she actually believes that they're conscious, more sentient, conscious, that they have intentions, feelings, and that they communicate with humans. And, some traditional kind of, vision quests and certain sorts of drugs will allow you to understand this, according to her. So I'm not saying I agree with her, but she also made the argument that the plants want us to eat them because it's good for them. It's how they spread their seeds.
It's convenient.
It's yeah. Exactly. It's very convenient. So it does raise this question, I think, about,
So it comes back to the Douglas Adams experiment of
exactly. That's why I brought it up, exactly, because I was going to segue to maybe the plants are one of these kinds of things here. But on the other side too, it sort of opens you up to the idea that if science went against your view, if it turns out that fish are not sentient, then you're going to treat fish differently. Whereas on my view, I think I would treat them the same, because I have considerations that go beyond whether they're sentient or not, having to do with agency and dignity and so forth, that I think would be important in that case. But you're right that probably most scientists feel that fish are conscious, but it's not the universal view. And I think the most universal view is that as mammals and some birds. that mammals and some birds are things with a cortex of a certain kind. And the other ones, it's still not really clear, like an octopus or your lobsters or
Yeah.
bees
I
or
mean,
that thing. So it does seem like you could, given that, again, there's a flip side of this question about basing it on how the science turns out, that you're really gonna what, and then the science could be wrong and you're gonna be flip-flopping it back and forth. So one day it's okay to eat the lobster, the next day it's not. Whereas if it's just, a moral consideration, not based on the science, then you're free from that, which I think is the kind of senior point.
Yeah. And I do think we should follow the science where it leads, but I think we should do it with humility. We should think that our beliefs and credences are probabilistic. We're never 100% sure either way, that they're provisional, so we are open to new evidence, and that we should be prudent in that context as well. So just because someone writes a paper that says fishes aren't sentient, that doesn't mean they flip-flop in and out, right? You could still be prudent and work that through. But I still would stick to this idea that we should ground our attribution of sentience to, an evidence and reason-based naturalistic approach. And ultimately that sentience, that capacity to be another, is the grounding of the morality. And my understanding where the current scientific work is that there's actually quite a strong degree of consensus around mammals, reptiles, birds, fishes, decapod crustaceans, octopuses, and some really interesting work being done on insects and other invertebrates now as well. So at the Ascent Lab in London School of Economics, for example, Jonathan Birch and his team have been doing some fascinating work around bees, which, again, it's not 100%, but it's also nowhere near zero. It's actually a reasonable confidence that there's sentience there. And there's brilliant scientific work going on in welfare biology and different scales that, I think still give us pretty good confidence that a very broad range of animals, have a decent possibility of sentience. So again, I think you're right. There could be some risks and there could be some differences there. But ultimately, in practical terms, I think there's still such a rich overlap, and I would still follow the evidence where it leads and ground on that basis. While, as you say, leaving the door open, part of the prudence is saying, well, is it just technical, narrow, moment-to-moment sentience that matters, or are there other things? Is it autonomy, agency, the ability to have desire, dignity? Maybe some of these other things are like safety mechanisms we should put around these ideas, so that sentientism isn't only sentience matters and only sentient beings matter, but it's at least they matter. And if you want to go a little bit further, maybe that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of sentientism as that stronger view, that only sentient beings matter. But if it's at least sentient beings matter, then I think it's on. That was always my hesitant to be, am I a sentientist? No, because I don't think that's the only thing that matters. I think there's all these other considerations. But obviously it does matter. And it is an important consideration. So I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, I think that's important. And again, that's one of the shifts in my thinking over time, I think, because I was probably more now originally, and I think I've sort of, through some of the conversations I've had with philosophers, has sort of left that door open a little bit more, even though personally I tend to draw everything back to the sentience itself. But the other thing that I think links to that idea and that risk is that sentientism is quite neutral about degrees of sentience and degrees of moral consideration as well. So there are many sentientists who will at least aspire to a much more egalitarian view, where they'll say, look, if a bee is sentient and a pig is sentient and a human is sentient, however different their sentience is, they're all sentient, they're equivalent, they matter in exactly the same way. Where there are others, including me, who will say, look, in my sense, and this will come on to the philosophy of mind topic, where many other sentientists disagree, that sentience is likely to be an evolved class of computation. And as such, it has a dizzying, dazzling variety that you probably can't measure on a single scale. It's probably multidimensional. It's very radically different, even within our species. And when you go across the species boundary, the varieties are mind-blowing, the different senses and different experiences and so on. So I think there's an enormous variety of different sentiences. So I think it is possible to think about different degrees of sentience. We've got to be very careful about that, because that's another way of privileging us as humans and pretending we're the most sentient. But that could also lead you to differential degrees of moral consideration as well. And I think ultimately that approach does also mean you're a bit more ready to cope with the potential that the lower bound of sentience could be a bit fuzzy and a bit porous. And you could think about plants, you could think about different philosophies of mind that push sentience, more broadly out into the world. And thinking about graded moral consideration, degrees of sentience, enables you to cope with that in a way that a sort of purer, every sentient being matters exactly the same.
Yeah, like Bentham, each counts as one.
Yeah, it would make it tough for you to cope with that.
Yeah.
If you want to be really egalitarian about it.
Okay, so I know I can't keep you forever, but I have so many things I want to ask you. But I wonder if, just to cover all of our anti-vegan bases, because I'm curious in what people have thought about this for a long time and seriously have to say about these issues. But when it comes to plant farming, it's a bit idealistic to say that that is somehow free of harm to animals. Because obviously pesticides, obviously harvesting, that kills animals in the process and so forth. So actually vegans are, even living on a plant-based lifestyle, contributing to the harm of animals. Now, of course, we're not moral saints and no one wants to live up to that standard. But it does, I think, legitimately raise the question, how realistic is it for there really to be this kind of sentimentalist sentient, I say sentimentalist philosophy, sentientist kind of worldview that really takes into consideration the point of view of all of the sentient beings, how many there are, because it's impossible to navigate any realistic way of living without doing harm. Or at least you might think we'd have to radically change the way we do agriculture to even make a dent in this. So I do wonder, like, what you think about the practicality of implementing these ideas in that regard.
Yeah, there's a strong human tendency in many fields, but particularly in ethics, for binaries and clarity and purity. And I think they're often counterproductive, because when we say, okay, well, we'll have a binary approach, we'll have a pure approach, we'll have an approach that's 100% clear, that does lead us to, I think, arbitrary calls, just to sort of assuage our own need for that clarity. So sentientism, as I mentioned before, it doesn't say you can never harm and you can never kill, you can never exploit any sentient being. It says we should have moral consideration for them all. And that does leave the door open that, it's almost impossible to live without causing some harm or some exploitation or some even death for other humans, let alone non-human animals. So it gives up on that sort of idea of a perfect purity where we can't, we could live somehow without causing any harm whatsoever. It gives up on that while maintaining a seriousness about the moral consideration that at least motivates us to find a better way. So in the agriculture space, I think that's a really important point, because if, for example, you present veganism as some sort of unimpeachable moral purity standard you've achieved, and then someone challenges you on crop deaths, well, your world starts to collapse a little bit, and the coherence of your stance, looks a little bit more wobbly, because you've made a claim about perfection and purity that could never be sustained. And I think most vegans and most sentientists would actually look at that with a genuinely sentiocentric concern and say, absolutely, yeah, crop deaths are a problem, right? There are pesticides and harvesting injuries and deaths and so on. Those matter too, in the same way as the suffering of wild animals matter. Every sentient being matters. Where that then takes you, one is that drives an even stronger motivation to transition to end all animal agriculture, because as we know, feed conversion ratios mean that for animal agriculture to operate, you need, between 4 and 20 times the amount of feed crops to feed to those animals. So animal agriculture basically wastes about 90% of its inputs. You take all of the feeds that are grown through plant agriculture, which causes those crop deaths, and you lose 90% of it because most of it's turned into blood and shit and sweat and heat and waste products, right? So animal agriculture itself is the most catastrophically wasteful way of producing food you could imagine. And it drives enormous chunks of the plant agriculture that's out there that's also causing the crop deaths. So you're causing the animal deaths plus multiples of the crop deaths. Whereas if we transition to a plant-based agriculture, yes, there would still be crop deaths and incidental harms there, but there would be radically less because you'd lose the animal agriculture, but more importantly, or even as importantly, you'd lose all of the feed crops too. So the simple story is an easy way of visualizing when you think about land use. So half of habitable land on Earth is taken up by agriculture. Only 1% is lived on by humans, but half of the habitable land is taken up by agriculture.
Wow.
And most of that is taken up by animal agriculture, the space for the animals, but then the feed crops to feed the animals. So if we transition to a completely plant-based agricultural system globally, which I know may sound like a pipe dream, but there's no reason we can't do it. We could do it, it's just political will and social norms that are standing in the way. We would reduce our agricultural land use for the same calorific and protein output by 75%. We could produce enough food and calories for the current human population on a quarter of the agricultural land. That's like freeing up North America and Africa in terms of land size, right? So one, the plant crop deaths we should face up to and acknowledge, but it's another reason for driving to end animal agriculture. Yeah. But then the second thing is it should absolutely motivate us to improve plant agricultural systems as well. And there's some brilliant people doing just that. They're working on ideas like veganic agriculture, where there are agricultural systems that don't use pesticides, that don't use animal manure as fertilizers, that take a cyclic approach based on crop rotations. And there are all sorts of new technologies coming in that could mean we could radically improve plant agriculture as well. So again, it's similar to the conversation we had before, where this sentientist worldview doesn't mean there's going to be an easy answer to every problem, but at least it sets out the motivation to drive you towards finding a system that's more compassionate. But yeah, pretending we're in some sort of state of moral purity by being vegan today is, naive and brittle. We're just, going in the right direction, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. I tend to agree with that. So it's oftentimes we act as though there's nothing we could do. It just has to be that way. But there's obviously many things we could do. It's just a matter of whether we want to do them. And do you really think we could transition to a full, suppose the world tomorrow decided within the next 20 years we want to be vegan, the world. You think we could transition all to plant agriculture, feed all the world's population, without radically changing, the way that food is shipped, produced, or accessed? Many people, I feel like it's just not a feasible option for them to live a plant-based lifestyle because of, it's expensive. I'm obviously upper middle class white guy making decent money. I can afford to live a vegan lifestyle, but it's fucking expensive, man. It is incredibly expensive. You know what's not expensive? A Big Mac at McDonald's. That's very cheap. But eating actual quality food is quite difficult to get, first of all, and expensive to buy. So it would take more than just like growing a bunch of food. It would radically you have to give access to people in places of the world where they just don't have it right now.
Yeah.
So it would be
I think
more
it is
than
possible, but I think it is possible, but it is absolutely a transformation of the entire food system. I don't want to underplay how challenging that would be. But I do think it's absolutely doable, because at the top level, we're already producing 4 times more plant products than the entire human population needs. So the scale is there. But you're right that the nature of those crops would have to change. The production process would have to change through the entire supply chain. The shipping, the distribution, all sorts of things would have to change. The political will would have to be there. The social norms that would have to change would have to change. But I think those things are addressable, because if you think about the amount of money in terms of government subsidies and corporate influence that are driving the current animal agriculture model, if we could transition those subsidies so that instead of perpetuating what's going on at the moment, and we could use them to improve food accessibility and product development and innovation and new supply chains, all of those problems are eminently solvable. And I think, again, when you dig under those issues, quite often the people telling you it's a problem have a motivation for explaining that problem. So the fact that it's socially difficult becomes an excuse, when actually that's the problem we need to fix. The reason it's socially difficult is because people say it's socially difficult. And the reason people say it's politically difficult is because, exactly, that's the problem we need to fix. So I do think all of those things are addressable. And it's also interesting because in the food space, there is this sense that for us to transition individually, you need to move from, a mixed diet of animal products and plant-based products to add all the alternatives in. And those alternatives often are more expensive. You said if you want a plant-based burger, you want an Impossible Burger, it will cost you more per pound than a cheap beef burger. But I'd say two things. One is the reason for that is because 99% of the subsidies are going into the animal products, and hardly any of it is going into supporting the development of these alternatives. And I think that will change, and it will change rapidly. But if you imagine taking those subsidies and shifting them onto improving the next Beyond Burger, I mean, things could look very different, because those plant-based alternatives don't have the waste of animal products intrinsic to their production, right? So they have an inbuilt advantage if only the subsidies and the lobbying would shift to support them. But the other thing I'd say is that we don't really need those alternatives. So there's an interesting survey done recently in the UK, and again, we're in a very lucky position here, where they switched from a standard diet to a plant-based diet that actually involved beans and pulses and lentils and plant products, and their weekly food shop went down by 30%. So if you go from a standard omnivore diet to, oh, now I need lots of vegan cheeses and vegan burgers and Impossible Burgers, yeah, your shopping budget's going to go up. If you go to the types of products, tofu and tempeh and lentils and beans and pulses and rice and pasta and breads and and just fruit and vegetables and all the things that people around the world have been eating for thousands of years before Western industrialization and colonialization pushed animal agriculture on them,
right?
You can drop your food budget by 30% today. So yeah, in short, I agree it's a big societal systems transformation, and there are brilliant people working on all of those different paths and how to make it work. But with the right political will, I think it could happen remarkably quickly, and it needs to happen, not just ethically, but for environmental reasons and waste reasons. And
well, I mean, environmental stuff is
health
interesting,
reasons too.
because I read a paper that was saying that if the whole world turned vegan, it'd actually be worse for the environment.
Bizarre.
So,
It's
yeah,
a bizarre argument.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think it's always interesting to work out who wrote those reports, which institute they came from, and are they funded by the Beef Federation, right? Because there's a massive industry that is driving. It's what big tobacco did, what big oil did, and are still doing. Big animal agriculture is using the same lawyers, the same lobbyists, the same funded scientists to do exactly the same thing, just querying the pitch. But when you look at the raw facts of the waste driven by the feed conversion ratios, when you look at the land use and the potential to rewild and recapture carbon by giving up on agriculture in those spaces, and when you look at the emissions, the CH4, the NO2, the CO2, the land pollution, the water pollution, the list just goes on. I mean, if animal agriculture didn't exist today and you suggested it, people would think you were functionally insane. I mean, it's probably one of the most crazy things you could imagine. And that's true even if you don't care about non-human animal sentient beings. Even if the ethics doesn't register, it's one of the most insane things we could do as a population.
Interesting. Okay. So I want to ask about something which was recently invented, which I don't know if you've heard of this or not, but it's called meaty rice. Have you heard of this? Okay.
Yeah.
So the scientists have infused beef cells into plants, growing a kind of hybrid. So that meaty rice is not sentient, one assumes, if you have a view about rice where it's not sentient. Obviously, some animals were harmed to get the cells. But once you have that product, is this a good idea? I mean, is this something?
So again, you'll get different answers from different scientists, because some will say there's an ethical association problem there, right? Even if it's cultivated meat that causes no harm, there's an unpleasant ethical association between that flesh and the historic practices and harms that are done. And you can see that, interestingly, in intrahuman ethics as well. There are certain things where you could say, well, this is the thing that hasn't harmed anybody, but it's associated with something really horrific. So there's a sort of association ethics there. That can also link to a dignity ethics that can, again, say, look, if you had to do that with cultivated human flesh, wouldn't that feel like there was some affront to human dignity? I mean, personally, I tend to be a little bit more technical and narrow in that ultimately, if there's no sentient being harmed or exploited or killed in that process and it solves the problem, I'm pretty comfortable with it. There are quite a few other scientists who are like, still nervous about that for other reasons, or
Yeah.
would want to find a different way. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm nervous. I mean, this is one of my things about the whole fake meat industry. Is like when I grew up,
Yeah.
I used to think I liked fake meat. I liked eating Satan and tofu and these sorts of things. And then as they became more Impossible Burgers and stuff, I really, um, well, it's hard to describe, but it's not that, when I eat these things, they're very flesh-like, and I'm terrified of losing the ability to tell the difference
Yeah.
between something which was produced by suffering and harm and something which wasn't. So I'm like really afraid of like biting into a steak and thinking, this is delicious, and finding out, no, that's a real cow.
Yeah, there's
As
almost like a
opposed,
risk of renormalizing something we think is horrific. It's like,
yes, exactly. And
yeah,
I
don't
think,
we
yeah,
want to draw the lines more cleanly?
exactly. So this is
Yeah.
something that's given me pause in my own life. But at the same time, my wife's parents who are not vegan eat Impossible Burger and say it's less, they feel less filled, and I mean, it's less heavy and less weighed down, and that's better. And I was like, okay, so for people like that, that's a really great product, and we need those sorts of things. But I
Yeah.
do wonder, like, yeah, like this company called Chunk that makes these like meaty steaks. Like, why? Why? I don't know if I can actually eat one of those things. It is a bit weird. So I don't know how much of it is just like my ickiness factor, not if there's really
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
going on here. But yeah, these things.
And I don't know where you wanted to go next, but I wondered if it might be interesting because there is a tendency when talking about sentientism that we do zero back in on agriculture and food and
Mhm.
veganism, and because that's probably the most obvious clash with current social norms and practices, right? That's the obvious
Right.
thing where you go, well, okay, evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings sounds sensible, but then it smashes into humanity's current practice and what we think of as normal. So the two problem challenges really are, I guess, religious worldviews that are grounded in fideism and dogma, and the other one is this big beast of animal agriculture, but wider animal exploitation as well. So often we do zero in on agriculture and food systems and veganism. But one of the interesting things has been, I think there are implications everywhere else too.
Mm.
So in the same way as if you're serious about, a Buddhist worldview or a Christian worldview or a humanist worldview, if you have a sentientist worldview and it shapes how you understand reality and the tools you use, and you have a moral scope that includes every sentient being at least, you can run that through every domain of human endeavor. It's not just about food systems, right? So you can
Yeah.
think about sentientist politics and economics and law and culture and language, and the list goes on. You can re-engineer the Sustainable Development Goals to be sentientist development goals. You can rewrite the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. You can think about sentientist education. What would it be if we taught kids in a sentientist way? So I just wanted to,
Broaden it out.
before we
Yes.
wrap up, see if there's any other sort of interesting stuff beyond the food systems and agricultural space that it might be worth digging into, or just to let people know that that's other stuff is out there too, and the other thinking is out there too.
Yeah, I know. I agree with you because what's interesting is like someone recently told me that raising my children vegan was child abuse. They said I was,
Seriously.
yeah, they said that I was brainwashing them by teaching them about, care for animals and having a
Yeah,
compassion for them and stuff.
ethics is brainwashing.
Yeah, so I do think that you're going to get a pushback if you want to say, sentimentist and sentientist education or politics. There is this kind of,
Yeah.
I mean, my response was no, it's you guys that are doing it, like putting a dead animal on the table and saying that that's normal. When the same child sees a dead bird in the street and runs away crying, is just
Yeah.
inconsistent in my view. It's just completely inconsistent. That's a dead animal on the table. And I certainly remember that when I was a kid, going over to people's houses and watching them eat chicken and I had chickens that I considered my friends at home. And I was like, this could be one of my friends on the table over here. You guys are eating my friends. Like, this is insane. So the idea that you want to treat the animal as something, or teach people to treat animals as something that matters or is important, some people find that idea deeply offensive.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that I don't know if that's like a defense mechanism Or I don't know. So I think that, obviously vegans get a bad rep because everyone thinks we're sanctimonious and judgmental, and, all the jokes about vegans being on their high horse. Hopefully, this conversation is going some way to dispelling that idea, because I think what your points you're making is that that's not the right view, that those vegans are dogmatic. And that's not the kind of, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. But this general idea that you want to expand this worldview into education, into politics, as opposed to, people are fine, it's your personal choice. Like someone told me, hey, if you want to only eat popcorn your whole life, that's your choice, but don't tell me what to eat. And I was like, well, it's not exactly, that's not why we're doing it.
Yeah.
But they want to restrict it to this like personal choice as opposed to like this deep societal issue. So
and they'll do that in a way that they would never apply to intrahuman ethics. And I think that's where you see what's happening, right? The way it's framed as a personal choice, is trying to say, look, we should have a completely different ethical system for how we think about non-human animals. Whereas if I said it was my personal choice to, hurt my kids or, do something horrible to other humans, no one would say, oh, that's fine, that's your personal choice. And it would be indoctrination to explain to my kids that it's wrong to hurt others.
Yeah.
So, but I think it's partly just because we're very social animals, right? So what is socially normal is understandably more important to most people than what is theoretically ethical, right? And that's the sort of the battle that humanity has always been in a way.
Are you optimistic about change in the future on this broader scale, not just about diet, but about all the things that you just mentioned?
Well, ultimately I am, and it's difficult because these social norms are so pervasive and they can feel all powerful. It feels like forces are arrayed against you. And it's one of the reasons why vegans sometimes are a little bit susceptible to conspiracy theories, because we really are the tiny minority who are absolutely convinced we're right. And the world is, shadowy forces are against us, right? So we're right about that conspiracy, just not the other ones. Not all the other ones anyway. So that can feel really tough, because when you say, look, here are the facts, and these animals are sentient, farming harms them, we don't need to do it. And you talk about the philosophy, right? We should care about all sentient beings because you care about the puppy at your feet. So why not a pig or a fish? Right. There are some people that works with, right? The facts and the ethics, it just works. But for most people, it doesn't, because they're driven more by, as I was, driven by social norms more than the philosophy and the science. So that is really frustrating. But I guess my hope comes from a couple of places. One is because so many people already agree with sentientism, at least in theory, right? So as we said right at the beginning, right, who would really want to believe things that aren't based on reality and evidence and reasoning, right? Even people who don't want to often frame it that way. So you're already most of the way there on the epistemology. And as you said, even people with a deliberately, faith-based view still will use evidence and reasoning in most of their lives. Often it's just, maybe it's compartmentalized in some way. So we're most of the way there in theory. But the same is true with the sentiocentric compassion too, because it's very rare to find a human who says only humans matter, because there are already cracks, right? They already care about some charismatic wildlife, or they care about the cat that shares their home with them, or they often will care about wild animals too, which is really interesting. So there's
these videos of like helicopters trying to rescue the horse that's caught in the ice. You're like, look at all this manpower and resources to save this animal. How is this consistent with what we do in other places?
There's a local community group here where a duck at a pond gets hit by a car, and the outflow of concern and compassion, and people are on the phone to rescue places and go and help. This is there, right? So again, on the sentiocentric side, people basically agree in theory. The other thing that gives me hope is working with the young people. So on this sentientist education thing, I do a lot of work with schools, even down to like 5, 6 years old, and 6-year-old kids are better philosophers than the average human on Twitter. And I know that is that's a very low bar, but these kids just get it, right? They feel this way anyway, right? Because most kids, they're sort of exploring the world honestly, trying to understand it. That is a naturalistic approach. They wouldn't put the word to it, but that's roughly what it is, right? I'm trying to understand shit. And they have that sentiocentric compassion. They don't want to pretend they're perfect, right? There are small boys who will pull the wings off flies and so on. But, you put a young child with a pig and say, by the way, their flesh tastes good, and they would look at you like you're crazy, right? So they start out at least reasonably attuned to this sentientist way of thinking, and then society takes them away. But young kids in conversations are brave enough to deal with these things and have common sense conversations about the implications of these stuff in a way that really gives me hope. So the frustration is partly about the sort of dead weight of those social norms, but there's also hope because we know social norms can change fast. It's not guaranteed. It's often 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or even 3 steps back.
Mm-hmm.
But even in recent years and decades, we've seen in certain countries and certain parts of the world really seismic, deep shifts in social norms. And I think people's intuitive philosophy means this change could really happen fast, because there's this latent ethic and this latent epistemology that people already agree with in theory. And if we can start to find the cracks in those social norms, and I think it's happening already,
Do you think there could be a
we can surprise ourselves at how quickly it could change.
Do you think there could be a sentientist country, one whose foundational doctrine was we hold these truths to be self-evident, all sentient beings are created equal, something like that? Or is that?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, I had a conversation a while ago on that topic about, could you imagine rewriting the US Constitution on a sentientist basis?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things one of the really interesting thought experiments. I've done it with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You can take loads of the things we've done to try and improve humanity's ethics and cooperation and just rethink it from a sentientist perspective. And, ultimately, I think that's where it should go. And it may seem fanciful, but you can already see parts of that happening. There are some countries in South America and in India and other places where they already recognize formally, not just moral consideration, but actually the personhood of at least some sentient beings. And they're doing that at the constitutional level, at the legal level. The cracks are already showing. So yeah, I can absolutely see a position where, a country would lay this out and move towards it. And maybe it could even happen at, regional or UN levels. Ultimately, these things could turn from thought experiments into reality. But I have a bias towards sort of naive, optimistic utopianism. So
well, change wouldn't happen without naive optimists. So, I think we need those types. Definitely. I mean, yeah. The world would be a better place. But I mean, my own personal view is I would like to give up eating altogether. I want to be photosynthetic. That's my goal.
I love that idea. I love that idea, which I heard you recently explain as another argument against, the perfect triumvirate deity, because they would have made humans photosynthetic, surely.
That's my position. Yes, exactly. It's like, I think puts a problem of evil just really in an almost irresistible form, that if there really is perfect being, then there's this very clear, better way of doing things. And, I even like the idea that if you like the taste of bacon, then the sunlight in the evening could taste like bacon. And, the breeze in the afternoon could taste like Cheerios. I mean, if you have all power, you can make things any way you want. So I really do find that people, when it comes to, thinking about what a deity could do, really limit themselves. And what they really are thinking is like what a powerful human could do or something like that.
Yeah.
But like really entertain this idea of like full control over reality. People don't take that seriously. If there really is a being with full control over reality, and if it really is moral, it wouldn't be like this. As the most obvious thing in the world to me. This is like, just look around. But okay, so I do know that we're getting on in time, and I do have some questions that have come up in the chat. So I wonder if you could stick around and answer a couple of these questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so one of them has to do with your definition of sentience. Which I guess came up here and there in our discussion. And I think maybe you kind of partially answered this already, but this is from Pooja Soni, who says, if what it is like to be a sentient being means to be able to experience suffering or flourishing, like pain and pleasure, then what about people that are catatonic? So is someone in a coma sentient on your view?
So I would, I mean, this is another area where I'd probably defer to philosophers like you to do this properly. But the way I frame sentience is the capacity to have experiences, and a sentient being is a being that has the capacity to have experiences. And I describe it as it has to be a current capacity, even if it's not exercised. So, for example, if someone said, a human spermatozoa or blastocyst, should be counted as a sentient being because they have the future potential to be sentient, I would say, well, okay, they have the future potential to be sentient, but they're not a sentient being at the moment. Whereas a human who is catatonic, who had been sentient and could be again, I would still count them as a sentient being. Does that make sense?
So it's rather of, are they of the kind of thing that could be sentient, that could have experience?
Yeah, I mean, and again, we could get into the the medical scenario exactly here, because if they were catatonic and technically brain dead and could had therefore lost the capacity for sentience in the future, then I think they probably cease to be a sentient being at that point. So a dead human I don't count as a sentient being. But
Right.
if they're in a coma or they have the current capacity to experience things again, then I would count that. Yeah. And I'd also chuck in a bunch of epistemological uncertainty there about whether catatonic people might actually be having experiences that we're not aware of, because there's been some really interesting experiments recently where through brain scans and so on, people who were thought to be unconscious were shown to actually have conscious experiences and were able to communicate through certain means. So
Excuse me.
again,
Right. You're
I'm
thinking
always
of the
chucking in. Yeah.
The vegetative
So I'm always
state
chucking in
case.
some epistemological uncertainty just to throw some caution in.
Okay. So a person who was known to be insentient still deserves moral consideration on your view, or not?
I think it depends whether they have the capacity to be sentient. If they do, then they still count as a sentient being. But if they've lost that capacity permanently, then they're essentially dead and insentient.
Right. So on your view, you can't harm or be immoral towards a dead person?
No, I would say that I would say, yeah. In simple terms, I don't think they're a moral patient anymore. So we may well still have concerns about, their family's wishes, or we might have concerns about dignity, but yeah, I don't think a dead human is a sentient being and isn't intrinsically a moral patient. We might have instrumental reasons to care and to treat them with respect and so on. But
so on the other side, Pooja also asked you about single cell organisms, microorganisms. They don't count as sentient on your view, one assumes?
So sentientism is again, it doesn't tell us where the boundary of sentience lies. And irritatingly for many of your audience, it's also neutral on philosophy of mind as well, which can obviously have a radical shift in your view of the distribution of consciousness, if not of sentience. I mean, again, my personal view of the current scientific consensus is that those entities, like plants, are highly unlikely to be sentient and to have a subjective experience. And I guess one of the lines of argument I turn to that I find interesting and quite compelling is that of evolution. Because my sense is that, like pretty much everything about us, our sentience and our consciousness evolved. And again, as an amateur, the stories I found most convincing is that sentience probably emerged around the Precambrian as a result of mobile animals having a sufficiently complex decision environment that it became useful to have a valence sense of how am I doing now, how am I doing now, how am I doing now, that would lead you towards good stuff and away from bad stuff. And my guess is that's probably to use a biblical term, the genesis of sentience. So people like Ginsberg and Jablonka have developed ideas around unlimited associative learning, which is about the capacity to learn, to exist intelligently in that sort of environment. One of my guests, Walter Veit, has talked about pathological complexity, which is a related idea about, how complex is the environment that could kill or harm you. And when it gets to a certain level of complexity, sentience becomes a useful thing because it's like a currency you can convert lots of stuff into to work out how your life is going. So again, on that evolutionary basis, my sense is that single-celled organisms and the super simplest living things aren't sentient. It was something that happened from the Precambrian, and that sets roughly, where sentience and consciousness are in the animal kingdom today.
Okay, I see some other questions, but I kind of lost track of them. There's a lot of comments going on here. So, one thing that I joked about a long time ago was, we'll see if you have any questions. By the way, feel free to put them in now while I'm stalling for just a second. One thing that I joked about a while ago was about uploading minds to the computer. So speaking of philosophy of mind, you mentioned that you view sentience as based on some kind of computation. So I do wonder what you think about mind uploading, and then how it relates to this issue. Because the joke that I made was that in the future, people can like slaughter the turkey and eat its body, but upload its mind to the digital farmyard where it can live eternally.
You're still looking for
full
ways
paradise.
to have your turkey sandwich, aren't you? Yeah.
I've never had turkey. I've never had meat.
I know.
In my entire life.
You wouldn't eat your friend.
Yeah, exactly. But I just, I think it raises this question. I mean, part of the reason why I made this joke was because I think it had to do with like respect for the body. Like it still would be in some way. I don't feel comfortable, but I do wonder, like, yeah. So what do you feel about uploading, generally speaking, and these kinds of issues like transhumanism and those sorts of things?
Yeah. So my best guess, and again, I have different credences for different things, but my favorite is that sentience and consciousness are classes of evolved computation that evolved in biological beings. But because of that, I don't see any reason why they couldn't operate in some other substrate as well. So as well as being anti-speciesist, I guess I'm anti-substratist as well, right? You could run it in anything. So that would at least conceptually lead you open to the idea of sentient AI or sentient uploading. But sentientism, again, is irritatingly neutral on that topic. So it doesn't suggest a philosophy of mind. As long as you take a naturalistic approach to working things through, you go anywhere you like. So I know sentientists who are illusionists, even eliminativeness. I always struggle to say that. Who have a more sort of functional computational view, physicalists, or a panpsychist.
Wait, there are sentientist illusionists?
Yeah, and part of the reason, let me put it this way. One of the ways I say it in a common sense way is whatever sentience is, it matters, right? If I stick a fork in the back of your hand, you won't like that, and that should matter to me morally. And I think that's true even if you think consciousness is an illusion, phenomenal consciousness is an illusion. I think even if you think phenomenal consciousness doesn't really exist or is an illusion, that would still matter to you, and I would still call that thing sentience, even if you don't think phenomenal consciousness exists. And that's part of the reason why I've tended to focus more on sentience as a term than consciousness, partly because sentientism is already quite a clunky word, and consciousnessism would be even worse. It's like another syllable. But it's also because I do somewhat want to sidestep some of the challenges of philosophy of mind and remain a bit more neutral on them. And that can work in two ways. One is because many people load a load of extra stuff into consciousness. So some people will say that consciousness isn't just about awareness or capacity to have experiences. It's also about an advanced model of the self, or the ability to plan for the future, or creativity, or loads of other stuff they want to bundle in, which often is part of a desperate attempt to restrict it back to humans. So I want to say, well, okay, that's fine, you can do that if you like, but sentience to me is, in that context, the morally salient component of consciousness. It's just this capacity to have experiences, which gives you the capacity to be impacted negatively or positive, and that's the raw material of morality. So you can add in loads of stuff to consciousness, but sentience just is that basic minimal capacity to have an experience. But it can also so that means that even if you think phenomenal consciousness is an illusion or doesn't exist, that still leaves you open to thinking about affect consciousness or other things that you could still imagine that comprising sentience. But it also helps the other way. So if someone has a panpsychist approach where they think that ultimately consciousness is foundational to physics, and even very simple things, if they even are things like electrons and protons, might have some absolutely minimal raw form of consciousness, because ultimately the universe is made out of consciousness. Again, sentience enables me to sort of step to the side of that and say, well, those micro consciousnesses, might be conscious in your definition. I don't think that's a useful definition. I think you've just destroyed what we mean by consciousness, but let's fine. We'll go down that route. And I've had fascinating conversations with people like Luke Roloffs and David Pearce and Emerson Green about this perspective. But if the micro consciousnesses are minimally conscious, I don't think they're sentient, because they don't have the capacity to have experiences. Whereas a macro conscious, once you've broken through the combination problem and you've got to, simply animals and so on, those macro consciousnesses that we typically think of as conscious, and I think of as conscious, are also sentient. So in a way, and with some of those conversations, that's been interesting, because someone like Luke Roloffs has a very different philosophy of mind from me, but we both practically set our moral scope in quite a similar way, because he agrees with me that you probably can't harm an electron. even if it's conscious, whereas you absolutely can harm a pig or a fish. Or does that make sense? So
it does, yeah. I wonder,
yeah,
there
so
are
that's
some
partly why,
panpsychists.
those are the two reasons why I sort of focus on sentience rather than consciousness. But
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I understand. But there are, I mean, I'm thinking of people like Hedda Mork, who thinks that, that these micro consciousnesses are valenced. So that the reason why electrons and positrons repel each other is because they don't like each other or something like that.
yeah,
So that a little tongue in cheek there, but that there's some kind of valenced, and even people like Philip Goff who think that there's a kind of fundamental tending, an intentional kind of towardsness that these microparticles have. So
my sense of those things is it's once again it's us humans taking stuff that matters to us and pushing it into other entities where I just don't really think it belongs. And we can do that well in some ways, right? If I anthropomorphize a pig because I think that they probably suffer just the same way I do, that's based in reality and it's ethically positive. But for me to say, well, I feel intention, agency, and therefore I think it must somehow be primordial and present even in a photon.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a mistake. That's another one of these things of us humans sort of imposing ourselves on the universe in inappropriate ways rather than recognizing with humility we're just a weird tiny pocket of it. And I guess that's partly the conversation I have with panpsychists about, okay, well, what would the experience of a photon be like? Because it's an experience without interoception or proprioception or nociception or sensation or thought or language or even the passage of time for a photon, because they're moving at the speed of light, so time doesn't even pass. So what, I guess the first question is, what would that consciousness even be like? Because you've stripped every aspect of my consciousness away from it. I don't think there's anything left, right, that's meaningful. Yeah. And it's certainly not morally salient, because I don't think you could hurt a photon or frustrate a photon, or, being hurt or frustrated requires other stuff going on that these entities just don't have the capacity to do. But even then, some people will, I don't know if you had a chance to see Thomas Metzinger's recent book, The Elephant and the Brain.
Yeah, I just started reading it.
Oh, cool. But in a way,
I want to get him on the podcast eventually.
That would be a fascinating conversation, because in a way, I don't think he would answer the question this way, but I think some panpsychists would say that if maybe humans can have a contentless, even timeless, pure awareness that advanced meditators have, maybe that's what it's like to be a photon. I don't know. Again, I think we've taken this sense of course we're special and our consciousness is special, right? And it's the only thing we experience, right? We see everything through it, but there's a temptation to see it as so distinct that we then push it into primordial places that I just don't think it really exists. We're just another evolved ape on a branch of a tree of life on a weird little planet. I'm not sure there's anything about us that is really has to be primordial to the whole universe. I think
exactly.
We're less special than that, but in a way we're less special than that, but in a way we're more special than that, right? We're not,
right. Yeah. Okay, a couple more questions. No, I'm enjoying it. So one question from Nonplussed. How is normativity, quote, robustly grounded in reality, stance independent, world/brute happenings? Why not just make the case for how you wish things would be without normativity? Well, how they would be is normative.
And in a way, setting out these two tenets of sentientism distinctly is sort of recognizing that for some people, a naturalistic understanding of the world doesn't mandate a sentiocentric normative stance, right? So if you don't feel that, then that's why these two pillars are there somewhat independently, right? It's I believe naturalistically, and I choose to have a sentiocentric compassion, and they're two things that you might feel are just distinct, and if you don't choose them, you don't choose them. So in a way, that's a recognition of that challenge that we were talking about earlier on about grounding and moral realism,
right?
But I think at the very least, the two go really well together, because if you do have a sentiocentric compassion, that drives your motivation to understand reality, because presumably you want to make it better or less bad for the sentient beings. So that drives you to want an understanding of reality that is grounded in reality because you're motivated to change it or at least not make it worse. But I think it works the other way around as well, because as I said, that evidence and reason-based understanding of reality has led me to appreciate that there are sentient beings like you who don't seem to like suffering and seem to want to live and seem to want to enjoy quality time with their families. That has driven my ethical normative stance as well. So I think, they might not be locked together. They could be independent. I do think they work quite well together. But there are some people who insist that all you need is epistemological naturalism, because if you follow that path, it will enforce you going to a sentiocentric moral scope. But it's partly because I'm not sure how convincing that is, that I insist on these two tenets being there, these two pillars.
Very cool. Okay, interesting. And then finally, one last question from Cheyenne Smith. Is a, quote, thing conscious if it knows what it's doing or shows signs of knowing what it's doing individually all by itself? I'm not.
So that's a really interesting question. And I guess it takes you into the philosophy of, what does knowing mean? I think if a being is aware that it knows something, that is sentience, because it's the awareness that counts. But if the knowing is, a register in the CPU of a Roomba or a spreadsheet in my laptop, it knows how much money is in my bank account, for example. I don't think that counts, because I don't think there's an awareness of the knowing. So it sort of depends on what you mean by knowing. But I would say an awareness of knowing implies sentience. But if it's a narrower sense of knowing, where it's, a list on a piece of paper or something, then it doesn't quite count. And the other thing that's really interesting in this space is how the language shifts. Because I think as you go from being insentient to sentient, you stop being a thing and become a being. And you stop being an it and become a them or a he or she if they're gendered. And so that it goes back to what we were talking about before, that, the way we think is infused into our language, and sometimes changing our language can be an interesting way of shifting opinions and minds as well.
Yeah. Okay. So, and then finally, I know we've talked about everything under the sun and beyond it, but was there anything that hasn't come up yet, which should have come up? The answer can be no, but I just want to check.
It's difficult to say no, because this topic might seem like it's quite a weird sort of niche philosophical worldview, but because it's talking about how we understand reality and what we should and who we should care about in reality, it affects absolutely everything. So I guess that's the closing thing I'd say, is that it's a really interesting thought experiment to run these tenets through absolutely every aspect of human life, and just to be brave enough to challenge. When we bump, so much of humanity is based on, we think about the way what's normal to us, and we think about the implications of an idea and use that to reject the idea. It's like backwards philosophy. Whereas I'd really encourage people just to start from the epistemology. I want to understand reality based on evidence, reason, with a dose of humility, and imagine a sentiocentric compassion, and then work through the implications, and then just be brave enough to face those implications, even if there's some social challenge or some politics you bump up against, or some. That's the bravery, but we can do it, and the more people do it, the easier it becomes. And ultimately, absolutely. I think that's the key to whatever progress we've managed to make ultimately in humanity, and I think that's the key to whatever promise that might be in front of us too. But one thing that's true, right? Whatever your view of humanity, whether we've managed to make progress or not within the human scope, our impact on sentientity, right? If you want to go from humanity to sentientity, has been pretty egregiously awful, right? Even if you're someone who likes Steven Pinker's graphs that all go in the right direction, right? If he'd written it, and many don't, if he'd written a chapter about non-human animals, non-human sentient beings, the charts would be all going the wrong way. So I guess that's the other thing, right? That can lead people into a very negative frame of mind, but just imagine the potential shift we could make in the role humanity plays with all of our power in our impact on sentientity, which is not this separate thing. It's something we're part of too. So it feels like a weird thing to radically expand our moral scope, but the opportunity is phenomenal, and it will be good for us too, right? As with intrahuman expansions of our moral scope, it benefits those who are doing the expansion, who are privileged enough to do the expansion, right? This isn't some sort of altruistic thing. It's good for us.
Well, absolutely, I agree. And let me just say personally that I now consider myself a sentientist after having talked to you officially.
Wonderful.
And Jamie, I have to say on a personal level,
We have 7.8 billion left to go.
Cool. One at a time. But on a personal level, I just want to say that I really admire what you're doing. We need people like you who are optimistic, intelligent, willing to follow the evidence, and also brave to stand up and say, I'm not perfect. We don't need perfection, but we want to face these things head on. And in this world, it can feel so overwhelming, the crushing despair, especially for people like us who are sensitive to these kinds of issues. I know myself, I've cried myself to sleep many a nights just thinking about all the animal suffering in the world, all the human suffering in the world. So it can become incredibly like depressing and mind numbing to be surrounded by people who think all this stuff is normal. And to have people like you who are cheery, optimistic, and trying to make a better difference in the world, I just find it very inspiring. And I just want to say thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, likewise.
It means
likewise.
a lot to me. So hang around for 1 second. I'll say bye off the air. But other than that, I just want to say thank you again for joining me.
It's such a pleasure. And the only other thing I'd say is if you're feeling that despair, or even if you're curious about the things we talked about, just reach out, because there are building communities of people who feel this way, or at least interested in these ideas. So there are communities, there's the podcast, there's the YouTube, there's all sorts of forums. We're pretty much everywhere. If you just search for sentientism anywhere, you'll find us, and reach out. And the more of us there are, the stronger the solidarity will be.
And I will say that it's not, one of the, the continue heaping the praise on you. One of the other admirable qualities that you have is that you actively seek out people who don't agree with you. You're not just looking for an echo chamber of people who are saying the same thing as you. So being part of the sentientist community doesn't mean you agree with everything. You can go there and try and argue against everything that you're talking about, and you accept those people just as much. So I think that that's as equally important part of what you do, is that you want to welcome everybody, every point of view, and then you want to talk with them. Well, why is it that you have these views? As opposed to just saying, screw you, you're a bad person, you don't agree with me, I'm in my tribe, you're in your tribe. I think that is such a rare thing to find, someone who really wants to meet people where they are and find out like how to go to the next step with them. So by inviting people to the sentience community, I just hope that they realize that it's open to dissenters as well. It's open to everybody.
Absolutely. And I think it's important, because there's a real danger with ideas like veganism and sentientism and humanism, right? That they become their own dogmas.
Yes.
And it's intrinsic to sentientism. It has to be an anti-dogma. Right? If you're committed to evidence reason, you cannot slip into dogma, however convincing it feels. And the other thing is that even people who disagree with us on Twitter are sentient beings, so we have to engage with them with compassion. Right? So
it's hard to remember that sometimes on Twitter.
That's tough to do. It's tough to do, but I aspire to, at least.
Well, you aspire to it. I'd say you go a long way towards actually meeting that aspiration. So once again, thank you for joining me. Hang around for 1 second. I'll say bye off the air. But other than that,